Hey everybody, how you doing tonight? Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. I apologize on the delay. Now that we're doing this a little more fancy, it's not just me talking into my phone. I don't just hold my phone in front of me and talk into it. Now that I've got all these parts and all these different things, takes me a little longer to set up, but that's okay because it gives a better performance overall. We have a good better show here for everybody. So, welcome everybody. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Should be a fun show tonight, at least a fun chat. So be sure to tweet this out and share this on Facebook and Reddit and Twitter and wherever videos are shared and posted and wherever people are doing that. Should be an interesting show tonight. So yeah, let's just jump right into it.
Of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
All right. So tonight we're going to start out with a guest, but I'll be writing down super chats. The way we do things is I do the opening of the show, the opening remarks. Tonight we're having a guest in the opening. I do the opening remarks, and then from there I do the roll call where I call you out as I see you names and locations. And then the rest of the show is me answering your super chat questions. So if you have something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, by all means, just shoot us a super chat, and we will do that. And that's how it will work. So yeah, if you have something, by all means, send in a super chat. I'll just type it here. I'll type it down and we'll answer it in the second half of the show. Often the Q&As, the spontaneous Q&As are kind of the part of the show that people enjoy the most, where I just answer people's questions. I will answer all questions within reason. Sometimes I won't answer a question, but for the most part, I will. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. And our guest tonight, the guest is actually Max, Max the Sax. You know him as Max the Sax. Sometimes he goes by Max Reed. And Max is a leader of the Students and Youth for a New America organization, which is a youth organization aligned with the Center for Political Innovation. They're doing activism around the country. They're promoting socialism. They're involved in some important events. All right. Leon and George Sorrell wrote it down. And so we're going to bring Max on. He's going to talk about what's been going on in D.C., what's going on around the country with the Students and Youth for a New America clubs. So I guess we'll just jump right into it. Hey, Max, what's happening?
Hey, Caleb, how are you doing?
Well, honestly, it's been a little bit of a frustrating evening. A lot of things are taking longer. I intended to be on here at 8:30. It's now 8:50, and we're off to a good start. But hey, that's life, I guess. We're here. I'm with the audience. I'm happy. Couldn't be happier. How are things in D.C.?
Yeah, things are going well. In fact, the Students and Youth for New America branch here in D.C., along with the CPI affiliate here in D.C., are about to take part in a National Day of Action for Alex Saab. We're not just taking part in one. About a month ago, we took part in one in front of the White House and the Justice Department. But we're doing another one this Saturday at the Department of Justice at 11 a.m., along with Code Pink and other activists.
Yeah. I think I remember people saw the video, if they watched this channel, of you in front of the White House with your bullhorn there talking about 1776. That was pretty cool. Yeah. Well, we'll be looking forward to getting video from that. There's going to be a rally in New York City as well. There's going to be some folks in Boston who will take to the streets. And then there's going to be a protest in Miami outside the courtroom. So it's a National Day of Action to support the political prisoner Alex Saab. Did you get a chance to watch Lily's talk about Alex Saab at the CPI conference in Austin?
No, unfortunately, I haven't. I'm really busy this year, but I will definitely watch it probably after this live.
Yeah. We posted it just yesterday. It was a great presentation, very emotional and powerful. So I also, you wanted to mention some other upcoming activities that Students and Youth for a New America is involved with, right?
Yeah, indeed. Students and Youth for New America, or SYNA for short, SYNA. I mean, we're on fire. We're building branches across the country. We're getting working class youth from Virginia, from rural Indiana, from St. Louis, all over the country. Not just in the big urban centers, not just in uh, Greenwich Village, New York, or not just at your local DSA meeting. We're really on fire, especially for May Day. May Day is a big priority for us, and I think that the capitalists, I do believe, did they create Labor Day to like kind of offset May Day?
I believe so, yes. It was kind of a compromise. During the Roosevelt administration, they agreed they could have a Labor Day, but it couldn't be May 1st, the communist one. So it was a compromise. They had one in September. Labor Day of September is a compromise, so they wouldn't have the communist one. Yeah, but it started here in Chicago, right? It comes out of the
Yeah,
struggle for the 8-hour workday, the Haymarket protests, and the frame up of the anarchist activists who were struggling for the 8-hour day in Chicago. So very exciting stuff.
yeah. And Students and Youth for New America is taking part in May Day, man. We have an organizer named Paul out in Evansville, Indiana, rural Indiana, kind of small town, city-ish. And he's organizing a potluck along with other comrades in the area. He's been involved in the struggle for lower energy costs. There's this company called Centerpoint Energy that's been kind of extorting the residents of his area. And Students and Youth for New America, we're involved in these local struggles at our community level. We have to be. A lot of groups, just protest or just like, attend the rally, attend a book club, but like actual struggle matters, and taking part in, fights for your community and their well-being.
Great. And you're also going to have a May Day event in DC. There's some kind of May Day event planned, I understand.
Yeah, yeah. Along with some other left-wing groups, we're planning to have a May Day event in DC in Malcolm X Park. It's going to be pretty good. It's going to be a rally and then a march. That's at 1 to 5 p.m. It's going to be really good. So if you are in the area, if you're whatever political stripe you want to call yourself, a social democrat, Marxist-Leninist, scientific socialist, whatever you are, come out for Red May.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. Now, so Saturday, this coming Saturday, is a day of action for Alex Saab. Do you want to talk about the Alex Saab case? Do you want to give people the facts on that?
Yeah, so Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat. He was on his way coming back from Iran, and he was doing negotiations, getting over the blockade that the U.S. has put on Venezuela, which, according to I think the UN, has killed somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people, thanks to like the deprivation of food and medicine and stuff like that. It's absolutely horrific. Yeah, so he got caught in Cape Verde. The U.S. detained him. They basically strong-armed the Cape Verde authorities to detain him, and they've successfully managed to deport him to, I believe, Miami, Florida. And I think they've chosen that place for a reason. That's a big center of the Venezuelan exile community. There's a lot of really far-right groups there, and yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's a national day of action demanding the release of Alex Saab. So, all right. And as folks are aware, if you want to get involved with the Students and Youth for a New America or with the Center for Political Innovation, you can just go to cpiusa.org. There's a division of the website for Students and Youth for a New America. And there's also a division of the website to just join the CPI. So any other thoughts you want to share with us tonight, Max?
Not really. I mean, I'm really excited with what we've built with the Center for Political Innovation, with Students and Youth for New America. I mean, about a year ago when I joined SYNA, it was not in the place it is today. I'll say that much. But I mean, we have really built something. I mean, I can't be more proud of how many young people we've pulled together with our optimistic, constructive view of socialism, and also connecting it to our history. A lot of Americans don't know our history because we haven't been taught our history. But our history is a progressive struggle against imperialism, against racism. And in a way, we are the true Americans. We want to rebuild this country. We want to get better living standards. We want a better America. We want to fight racism. I mean, this is the stuff that won us the 8-hour workday. This is the stuff that won us Social Security. And we're a continuation of that legacy, and we're not going anywhere.
Very good. All right, Max. Well, thank you very much. Glad you could give us an update from DC. Have a nice evening. Yep. All right. That was Max out in DC, the legendary Max the Sax. Good to hear from him. Welcome, folks. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. So, a lot of things happening that we can talk about for sure. If you're not aware, Russia is going to start tomorrow to start accepting payments for natural gas only in rubles. Only in rubles will they accept payments for natural gas. And this is in response to all the dramatic moves that the Biden administration has taken to hurt Russia's currency. And that's a dramatic shift. The fact that natural gas will no longer be in dollars, but it'll be in rubles. There will be special exceptions, apparently, according to some Russian officials. That's a dramatic move. It's going to weaken the dollar, and it's going to significantly re-up the value of the ruble. The value of the ruble is already rising. The devaluation of the ruble that we saw at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict has kind of been canceled out. In other news, the January 6th investigation at this point is centering around the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife, Virginia Thomas, also known as Ginny Thomas. Ginny Thomas is her nickname. There's some concern about her support for the January 6th protest, the fact that she attended the Stop the Steal demonstration, and a lot of the texts that she exchanged with figures in the Trump administration are now coming up. And it appears that this January 6th investigation is the Democrats' attempt, it appears, to try and maintain their hold on power as the economy is getting worse, as things in the United States are not doing so well. January 6th and possible indictments and investigations are one thing they can do to kind of weaken figures from the Trump administration. So that is going on at the moment, and we'll see how that develops. But I wanted to also mention, one thing that we consistently talk about on these streams is the synthetic left, right? The synthetic left. The idea, there's a lot of people out there speaking in the name of socialism, speaking in the name of Marxism, speaking in the name of these kind of movements that are putting out something completely different, that are putting out an ideology that's not optimistic, that is pessimistic, that are basically serving the ruling class, supporting attacks on socialist countries around the world, opposing working class populism, but speaking in the name of socialism. And there's actually a clip. This is from my good friend Fox Green. Fox Green, he does a podcast called Space Commune, and they interviewed me about the CIA program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. That was the CIA manipulating left-wing thought in the 1950s. He interviewed me about it. And then he used the clips from the interview. Symbolism of the rocket ship in the CPI intro. All right. He interviewed me about it, and then he used, clips from that interview, audio from the interview that I did for his podcast to make this really neat documentary called Marxism and Energy. Marxism and Energy is, all right, how did former socialists, all right. And Marxism and Energy is the name of the documentary. And this is actually a clip from it about the Congress for Cultural Freedom that is just well-documented fact. And I'll say something else after that.
So part of how the left changes is just about the circumstances, but you have to then add to that conscious manipulation, right? Which is also a factor, because starting in 1949, the CIA launched a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom and started funneling money to anti-communist leftists. Generally, the people that made up the Congress for Cultural Freedom were followers of the Trotskyite Max Shachtman. And Shachtman, after World War II, his followers, one of them being Irving Kristol, who is the father of neoconservatism, started working for the CIA. And Irving Kristol was actually the director of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program, where they started covertly giving money to leftists in order to put out an anti-Soviet message. And the magazine Partisan Review, which was purported to be a communist socialist magazine, And it was all over the college campuses. Every campus you went to, you could find Partisan Review, and it was this subversive communist magazine, except it like every issue was devoted to exposing the Stalinists, much like in the way, people get gone after now. They would wage campaigns against one artist or intellectual who was aligned with the communists and for people to boycott their performances. And a lot of the, what was done in Partisan Review magazine was equating the Soviets with the Nazis, right? And saying that it's basically the same system. And direct CIA payments to pay for their operations were supplemented by the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks and other things. And various left-wing academics were getting subsidized by getting paid lots of money to have their articles appear in this magazine that was everywhere. And this was the conscious manipulation. And you talk about the Frankfurt School and the rise of this new, and it's weird because on the right, they have this whole thing about cultural Marxism. Right. Well, what they're missing is that a lot of these cultural critics that really emphasized Gramsci really downplayed the idea of class struggle. Emphasized. You had Herbert Marcuse, who said that the working class was not revolutionary; it would be the intellectuals who were the revolutionaries. All of this was being covertly supported as a way to kind of direct intellectuals and leftists away from Marxism. And in the process, they changed really the nature of what leftism was. The anti-populism came out. Susan Sontag is a really important voice in this milieu. And so Hannah Arendt also comes out of this. And anti-populism, the idea that average people are the enemy, that average people are dangerous, and if they ever get together and start fighting for their rights, that's basically the same as Nazi Germany. That became a big theme in what it meant to be a leftist, this kind of intellectual nonconformity.
Dealing with some quick technical problems here. Wild times, folks. Wild times. Absolutely wild times. Ugh. What a night. What a night, folks. What a night. 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 What a What a night. Wow. Well, everybody, I have had some crazy times in my life, and this is a crazy night. But anyway, yeah, that clip that I just showed, that was about um that clip I just showed, that was about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Do you plan on streaming full time? Will you stream on Twitch? And that was about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And the Congress for Cultural Freedom was a program where the US government was covertly funding various left-wing voices. Gramsci wasn't covertly supported. That's all right. Gramsci. Funding various left-wing voices. And the idea was to give Marxism or socialism an angle that would make it not revolutionary, that would serve the imperialists. It was covert manipulation of leftist voices, and it was a very effective technique. All right. Soviet communism, bad. Chinese communism, good. And it was a very effective technique for manipulating left-wing voices to be anti-Soviet, right? I mean, the idea was with this hardcore McCarthyism, people would be anyway, the idea was with this hardcore McCarthyism, people were effectively being manipulated. I'm sorry, I'm distracted. I got like a million things on my mind. I have to deal with something very quickly. So while I deal with something, I'm so sorry, folks. This is such a crazy night. While I deal with something, I wanted to show you a clip from this documentary. That I made a long time ago. I interviewed one of the founding members of the Workers' World Party. Her name was Frances Dostal, and she talked about the civil rights organizing that was done back in the time of the 1950s, and she talked about the role that communists played in the civil rights movement in this kind of documentary. So while I deal with something that I have to deal with, which is just I'm dealing with something. I'm so sorry, folks. I want to give you my full attention. This is a crazy night. So I am just gonna put this clip on, and then we're gonna deal with what I have to deal with, and then I will just continue. Wow, this is pretty wild. This is more like what normal streamers do, right? Normal streamers, they sit here, they play video games while they talk to you. I generally just like to talk at you, just answer questions. But right now, something happened right before I started streaming, and that I have to deal with, and so it's crazy. So I'm going to put this clip on, and then I'm going to deal with what I have to deal with while the clip is playing, and then I will give you my full attention. I am so sorry.
Spend quite a bit of time getting signatures to place them on the ballot. The Buffalo branch was regarded as being responsible for getting 13 upstate counties to have enough signatures to warrant the ISPs being on the ballot. And we spent quite a bit of time going around gathering signatures. When that task was done, we opened up a storefront headquarters on what I refer to as the Mason-Dixon line in Buffalo. It was an area right between the black and white communities, and we opened up a storefront there, and it was staffed during the day as well as during the evening by comrades. And it was freely accessible to interested people who could walk in and engage us in conversation. At the same time, Sam was very cognizant of the fact that many of the wives of comrades were much less politically developed than their male counterparts. And so he, and having recognized that I had a background, quite a background in Marxism, he asked me to conduct a class, which I did conduct with 4 women, and we conducted a class on a daily basis. Child care was provided by the party, and we had, I conducted a class of 2 white women and 2 black women, and we learned theory plus practice. We learned, for example, how to give a report to the branch meeting. And we all took our turn at the podium and reported on various activities that we had engaged in. And then the rest of the class critiqued the person who was doing the speaking. So it was a very practical class as well as a theoretical class. By the time the summer was over, we were ready at that time for the formation of the Mothers Alliance to Stop School Segregation, MASS, uh, because it was at that time that the first black student was going to Little Rock High School in Arkansas.
And therefore, in accordance with the solemn responsibilities and the oath of my office, taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
Can you tell me your name, please? Are you going to go to school here at Central High? You don't care to say anything, is that right? This girl here was the first Negro, apparently of high school age, to show up at Central High School the day that a federal court ordered it integrated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
That was a major thing in the news all the time. And the Mothers Alliance to Stop School Segregation demonstrated at the local Buffalo City Council and asked them to take a stand in support of the brave women who were sending their kids to school. At any rate, we had a very well-attended demonstration in support of the heroic mothers of Little Rock that were sending their children to an integrated school. And the Mothers Alliance subsequently became a local community organization, and was with the guidance of many of the people in the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, at the same time, the party was having an internal struggle over major relationships to the world events that were occurring, that were continuing to occur. And one of the things that was happening was the development of the civil rights struggle. It was, in fact, due to one of the members of the minority in New York, and namely Artie Rosen, that we even knew about Rob Williams in an infamous kissing case that occurred at that time. A little black boy had kissed a little black girl and was charged then with rape. And he was much too young to have done anything of the sort. But this was on in Monroe, North Carolina. And it was at that point that the local NAACP leader said that they had to defend themselves from the Ku Klux Klan and the white racists who used to ride through their community every weekend. And he said that they would fight back with arms in hand. And he, of course, had been in the U.S. Armed Forces for a number of years and was well trained militarily. And there was a great big furor about that.
I made a statement that if the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution cannot be enforced in this social jungle called Dixie, it is time that Negroes must defend themselves even if it is necessary to resort to violence. That there is no law here and there is no need to take the white taxes to the courts because they will be free, and that the federal government is not coming to the aid of people who are oppressed, and it is time for Negro men to stand up and be men, and that if it's necessary for us to die, we must be willing to die. If it's necessary for us to kill, we must be willing to kill.
Now, I forgot to mention that during the month of September, the United Steelworkers Union had a convention in Atlantic City, and on the way back from this convention, one of the members who had been a delegate to the convention was a comrade of the Youngstown, Ohio branch named Ted Dostal. Now, I had met the name Ted Dostal on the same weekend that I had arrived. I had arrived the Memorial Day weekend in Buffalo, New York. And I remembered hearing that there was a complaint from Ted Dostal that some of the work that was being done by the Buffalo Comrades in regard to a newsletter which he edited called The Militant Steelworker, had a problem with the lettering in the headline, which was a little crooked. And I remember Ted being referred to as, being just too punctilious about things like that. But I had never met him and did not until the Steelworker Convention was over, and he went back to Ohio by way of Buffalo, New York. It turns out that he was also part of the minority, that he had a point of view which coincided with that of Sam Marcy, and that they had been carrying on a correspondence for years. Those were the days when people still wrote letters to each other, even theoretical letters to each other, handwritten, not necessarily typed. At any rate, Sam made sure that Ted, who was going to spend the night in Buffalo, was surrounded by company for his dinner meal. And that's essentially where I met him. And but that was it, at that time. At any rate, the Mothers Alliance was going strong, and I returned back home to New York. My 6 months of my leave of absence were over, and I returned back home about 10 days before the fall elections in November, and resumed work. And instead of having my home neighborhood, I was now assigned to downtown Brooklyn, and I went to work there every day. Meanwhile, there was going to be a national committee meeting sometime in November or December, I don't even remember. And Ted came in as one of the delegates to that meeting. And I remember he talked and talked and talked to me about his work, the trade union work that he was doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember approaching Vinnie Copeland the next day and asking him, I said, "Is Ted married? What do you know about him?" Well, he wasn't sure. He just didn't know. It's very interesting that a lot of people were comrades and knew very little about the personal lives of the people that they knew politically. And I recall saying, well, he spent half the night talking to me about his work. And I recall Vince Copeland saying, "Are you sure we're talking about the same person? He's so taciturn." Well, I thought I knew what the word taciturn meant, but I went to the dictionary anyway, and in the dictionary it said silent. And I said, well, he sure wasn't silent to me. And that just goes to show you that when someone has a willing ear to listen, then the other person who is silent in the presence of speakers has something to say. At any rate, that was my experience with Ted. And we began to correspond with each other by mail. And now the minority in the party decided that in January, for New Year's Eve, they would have a get-together in Buffalo. And so people came that were members of the minority. There weren't very many of us outside of Buffalo. Buffalo was the stronghold. But there were a few people in Youngstown, Ohio. And that was probably it. Now, at the same time...
All right, folks. Now, that's from an hour-long piece I did interviewing this woman who was a founding member of the Workers' World Party. Her family had been in the Communist Party. And she's basically telling the story of how she met the man who was her future husband, Ted Dostal, a steel worker and a communist activist. She's telling how the split in the Socialist Workers' Party that founded the Workers' World Party happened. She's talking about the civil rights work that they did to support Robert F. Williams and to support, school integration and in Little Rock. It's on this YouTube channel, this documentary. You can find it that I made it. It's not the highest quality work I ever did. It was years ago. I had no experience, with camera work or anything. And as you can see, I'm always trying to get better at the tech angle of these things. But it's worth talking about. And actually, there's a very, very short clip from a movie. It's from the movie Reds. I don't know if people have ever seen the movie Reds, but it stars Warren Beatty. And it's a depiction of the founding of the Communist Party. And this is a very short clip from that movie. So I'm going to show this clip, right? If I can pull up that clip. I'm going to show that now. I guess I'm trying to make a point here, and this all adds up to something. So there you go.
And how many days a week?
7 days.
7 every day?
You don't come to work on Sunday. Don't come on Monday.
And what do you make an hour?
20 cents.
How many times have they slammed the door in your face? Because the labor you do is called unskilled.
That's right, bro.
Well, the IWW is not going to turn you down because you're unskilled.
Listen to him, George.
Or skilled. Or black. Or white. Or yellow.
7 days a week.
And what do you make an hour?
10 cents an hour.
One big union. All workers belong to the big union.
I'm looking for a lathe worker named Pasquale Alberti. He had an industrial accident. He got his leg crushed. Do you know him?
Yeah, sure, Harvard. Is that what they want to read about in Greenwich Village now? Industrial accidents?
And for that, we need power. And there's only one way to get power. Organize. All the workers together. One big union. And the war the IWW wants you to get into is class war. Not a war in Europe. War against the capitalists. You'll never get anything or anywhere until the whole working class belongs to one.
Anyhow, so that clip, that's interesting. So that is Hollywood, and it's supposed to be Bill Haywood. That individual, that large man who's agitating, is supposed to be Bill Haywood. But that clip is wildly historically inaccurate. Bill Haywood wouldn't have sounded like that. That accent is New York. That is a New York City accent. And this is what I'm trying to get to, right? I showed you the clip of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and I showed you the clip of Francis, and then I just showed you the clip from that movie. There used to be this layer of people in New York City and elsewhere who were communists, and they were class-conscious communists. And that actor portraying what was supposed to be Bill Haywood was not doing an impression of Bill Haywood. Bill Haywood wouldn't have sounded like that. He was from out west. He did miners, etc. That's what these people sounded like. And in the 80s and in the 70s and even in the 90s, and, I encountered these people briefly. There was a layer of people who were communists who talked about the proletariat, one class fighting the bosses and the capitalists. And those people are beautiful. They were absolutely beautiful. They were absolutely beautiful. They stood for a kind of politics that is largely missing in our time. The workers against the bosses, or I guess they would have said the workers against the bosses. They had this class consciousness, this understanding that it was about the very rich versus everybody else. It was about, the working class versus the capitalist class. It was about the factory owners versus the factory workers. It was the billionaire bankers that owned the politicians and the working families. And they had this very, very populist understanding. And that clip from that movie is more than anything, it's a tribute to that. It's highlighting that. And Frances Dostal, who I just showed you the clip of, you can watch the whole documentary interview I did with her. This is what they were trying to obscure. This is why the CIA funded the Congress for Cultural Freedom program. They were very afraid of this kind of class consciousness, of these folks who believed in class struggle, who built the civil rights movement, the anti-racist movement. These folks who were very revolutionary, and had this populist class struggle understanding of politics, folks who'd been around the Communist Party USA or been around groups that had come out of the Communist Party USA, they were something to be reckoned with. These were people who'd lived through the 1930s. These were people who had really learned how to struggle and how to fight, had organized, and really given their lives to revolutionary activism. And they were a very special group of people. And their politics is what is largely missing in our time. The Congress for Cultural Freedom, that made left-wing politics about the non-conformity of intellectuals and kind of hating average Americans as the enemy. That's not the same thing. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was put forward to kind of combat this type of politics. This type of politics was something very, very special. And this was the politics of Gus Hall. This was the politics of William Z. Foster. This is the politics that largely inspired the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers, they had been a lot of them had been around Progressive Labor Party or been around the the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had a lot of former members of the Young Communist League in it. And there was this layer of populist, anti-imperialist leftists in the United States who believed in standing against war, standing against empire, standing against Wall Street, and organizing mass demands to fight for economic justice. And that's what they're really trying to obscure. And that's what they're really, really trying to obscure when they demonize the Medicare for All marches that Jimmy Dore has organized. That's about trying to make sure that this kind of politics never comes back. I apologize for how disjointed this stream has been tonight, between, one thing and another. It was great to hear from Max and the work he's doing in DC. It was good I could just take a break there and show you the clip of Frances and her struggling and her, kind of going over her history of organizing for civil rights in the 1950s. It was good I could just show you this clip. But what we need to understand is that socialism is a fundamentally populist ideology. Now, populism doesn't mean racist. Populism doesn't mean demagogy. Populism is the opposite of that. It means working people coming together to see their own interests. It means standing against the very rich, the elite, the powerful, for the common people, for the working class. That's what populism is really about. And socialism was the original populism. Right-wing populism is a frankly very new development. You didn't really have right-wing populism until the 1930s. It wasn't really until, the rise of Mussolini and the rise of Hitler, and I guess maybe you could talk about the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, but right-wing populism is fairly new. Populism originally was very left-wing, and even the populist movement in the United States was originally an anti-racist movement. It came out of the Free Soilers and the abolitionists. It was people in the Republican Party who saw, after the Civil War, the Republican Party becoming more and more of an imperialist party, and they built kind of a working class movement. And originally, the populists were anti-racists. Populism, class struggle, working class organizing, this has been a big part of American history, and obscuring it is a big part of what our enemies are doing. They're trying to make socialism and Marxism and politics. They're trying to make that about something different. General view on unions today, vehicle to promote class struggle, or have they sold out each other's interests? That's a very good question, right? General view on unions today, vehicle for class interests, and this is what we need to get back to. And sometimes on these streams, I'm just highlighting things that you haven't heard about. Sometimes on these streams, I'm just trying to make you aware of things that you haven't been aware of. And, if you have a chance, go and watch, Memories in Red, that full documentary interview I did with Frances Dostal about her class struggle, politics, and about building the civil rights movement and about McCarthyism. If you have a chance, go back and read William Z. Foster and Gus Hall. Go back and read, there's a very good book, Why Communism? Plain Talk on Vital Questions by Moishe Olgin. This is where we came from. And this is the politics that won us the 8-hour workday, that won us the weekend in the United States. And this is the politics that laid the basis for the anti-Vietnam War movement. These people were protesting the Vietnam War long before it was trendy, long before the hippies were. It was Youth Against War and Fascism and the Young Workers Liberation League and the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs and the Progressive Labor movement. And those folks were protesting the Vietnam War from the beginning, and they kind of laid the basis of the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, there is a history of Marxist class struggle, working class politics in the United States. And the really evil and vile forces of the synthetic left are really trying to do everything they can to obscure that. And part of what we're doing on these streams is we are trying to revive those politics. We believe in class struggle. We believe in working class power. And we've got a lot of things going on in this time, right? I mean, I've got a lot going on. I mean, I don't know if folks saw the latest podcast that I did with Harpal and Jyoti Brar. Harpal and Jyoti Brar, they're leaders of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists. They call themselves the Communists. And they are a genuine class struggle, anti-imperialist Marxist party in Britain. And that's why I interview them, is they have that ideology, right? They're of Indian heritage. I believe Harpal Brar was born in India, but immigrated to Britain. And they are a class struggle Marxist organization. And that's why I want to highlight them. And they stand with Russia against imperialism. They stand with China against imperialism. They stand with Syria. Joti Brar went to Libya and saw the achievements of socialism under the leadership of Gaddafi. And so that's why I make a point of having them on there, because that's the politics we need. And if you go around the world, this kind of politics is very present, right? This is the kind of politics that you'll get in India from the Communist Party of India, Marxist. This is the kind of politics you'll get in Mexico from the PT, the Partido Trabajadores, or the Workers' Party. This is the politics that you will get in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. This is working class struggle politics. And this is what we don't have in the United States. And it's just been this huge effort to make Marxism not identified with class struggle. One of the saddest experiences I ever had is right after Trump got elected, I went to Wheeling, West Virginia. And Wheeling, West Virginia is a steel town where there's a steel mill. There's, steel workers. And I spoke to a steel worker, and he said that he had voted for Donald Trump, he said. And the reason he voted for Donald Trump is because the Democrats don't care about the working man any longer, he said. They're just a bunch of socialists. And I was shocked by that statement, because the very definition of socialism is being concerned about the working man, about the working class, right? That is the definition of what a socialist is. A socialist is people who fight for the working class. But in his mind, that's not what a socialist was. In his mind, a socialist was a college kid who's breaking windows. A socialist was somebody who hated average working people and saw them as a basket of deplorables. And in his mind, voting for Trump was a way to stick it to the quote unquote socialists, because he didn't think socialism had anything to do with the working class. And that is heartbreaking. That is absolutely heartbreaking, because that is not the politics of the socialist movement. The socialist movement is a politics of fighting for the working class. The socialist movement is the politics of working people fighting for their rights, unemployment councils, the Black Panthers free breakfast program. Socialism is an ideology that is optimistic fundamentally, that seeks to build a better world, that seeks for the banks, factories, and industries and major centers of economic power to be organized to serve the people and not the profits of a wealthy few. Socialism is about society taking control of the means of production and eliminating the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market, where profits are in command. It's about abolishing the rule of profits and putting people's needs first, reorganizing the economy so that growth is no longer restrained. There are artificial restraints put on human growth by capitalism, right? The problem with capitalism isn't that it creates endless growth. The problem with capitalism is that it holds back growth. In systems of the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. But only under capitalism do we have the problem of people being hungry because there's too much food. Systems of the past, people were homeless because there were shortages of housing. But only under capitalism do we have homelessness created because there's too much housing. That's the reality of the capitalist system. It creates poverty amid plenty. It is an irrational system. And right now, we are dealing with a huge glut of overproduction, because essentially right now, we have a situation where the computer revolution is taking production to more efficient leaps than ever before. With 3D printers, with artificial intelligence, machines can do things they never could have done before. And under capitalism, the more efficient technology becomes, the more technology advances, the poorer people get. Because under capitalism, your only value is renting yourself out to a boss, selling your labor power to a capitalist. And because technology reduces the role of the worker in production, great leaps in technology lead to greater poverty and long-term economic downturns. World War I was preceded by all kinds of economic crashes and panics that were caused by advances in technology. World War II came after the Great Depression, and the Great Depression was caused by Henry Ford and his innovations in assembly line production, which eliminated jobs. Capitalism is a system where increasingly the worker has less and less of a role in production. And because the worker's only value is selling himself to a capitalist, more and more people become cast out of the means of production and become impoverished because the ability to produce goods has increased. Poverty is created by abundance under capitalism, and this is fundamentally irrational. And the only way you can resolve that is to have the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power organized to serve public good, and not the profits of a few. Get rid of the profits in command, the irrationality of production organized for profit. Plan out production, have production be controlled by society. And at that point, you don't have this problem. You can regulate and determine how production is carried out. It's not left to the chaos of the market. And the result of that is growth going to even higher levels and eliminating scarcity and eventually breaking down inequality. The struggle against capitalism is a struggle to unleash human creativity and allow it to rise to even higher levels. The struggle against capitalism is a struggle to create greater abundance in society, to get rid of a situation where wealth creates poverty. We need a situation where poverty and wealth don't walk hand in hand, where society can grow richer, technology can advance, more goods can be produced, and society gets wealthier overall, and we don't have this built-in problem. This is the problem of capitalism. People think capitalism just means rich and poor existing. People think capitalism just means money existing. Capitalism is the rule of profits. It is profits in command, and socialism is the struggle to abolish it. Now, there was a super chat a while back from Shia, so I want to pull it up here. Right. The problem is most working people in the U.S. don't identify as workers, but prioritize other aspects. Do you agree? All right. Problem is that people in the USA don't identify as workers, but with other interests. All right. And this is what is needed more than ever, is people to identify as workers, people to understand that their economic interests are fundamentally against the economic interests of the capitalists. And in order to do that, we have to explain that we don't want to make workers' lives worse. Look, the synthetic left does want to make workers' lives worse. They think working people have too much stuff. They think the problem is overconsumption, that people are just, consuming too much. They want to reduce the population. They want to create chaos. They view average Americans as the enemy. This isn't Marxism, folks. This is not Marxism. Marxism is about lifting up the working class and building an economy where their needs come first. Marxism is about mobilizing working people in their millions, building a mass populist movement of working people of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religious backgrounds, different races, different genders, different politics, different communities, different regions, all coming together around an economic program that will improve their lives. That's what Marxism is. And these folks have distorted it. And these bread tubers, they really do believe working people are the enemy. They really do believe that we want to reduce consumption, drive down living standards. They really do believe that anyone who calls for working people to come together and fight for their rights is a Nazi, and that somehow that's fascist. These folks are not Marxists. Francis, who I just showed you, that's a Marxist. That clip I just showed you from the movie Reds of Big Bill Haywood talking about the IWW, that's Marxism, right? Marxism is labor unions. Marxism is unemployment councils. Marxism is class struggle. Marxism is calling for the means of production to be organized rationally according to serving public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. That's what Marxism is. Go and read the Communist Manifesto for yourself, right? I'm going to pull this up because, a lot of people, these bread tubers, they think they know Marx, and they don't. Right? I'm going to read you what Karl Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, what he says Marxism is. This is directly from the Communist Manifesto, right? I'm just going to read to you. This is what Karl Marx says, right? Right. All right. This is what Karl Marx says. The proletariat will use its political supremacy. Oh, no. First, we have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class and win the battle for democracy. To raise the proletariat, the working people, to the level of the ruling class and win the battle of democracy, right? As long as wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, as long as a small group of people own the banks, factories, and major centers of economic power and the oil wells and the airlines, etc., as long as that is the case, as long as that is the case, Iraqi refugees in California. All right. All right. As long as that is the case, it's not really going to be a democracy. But when the proletariat raises itself up to the level of the ruling class, you have the battle for democracy. And it says there, the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie and centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the productive forces as rapidly as possible. So the idea is the proletariat wins the battle for democracy, takes control of the government. We have a government of action that fights for working families, a government that represents the people, not the big corporations. And then that government, the proletariat, the working class, uses its political supremacy to wrest by degree, meaning not all at once, but gradually, take control of the capital, the economy, and centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, and to increase the productive forces as rapidly as possible. So by centralizing the means of production in the hands of this new government that is a working class government, the idea is they can then raise the amount of wealth in society, right? That is what Karl Marx is saying socialism is. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property, on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves and necessitate further inroads on the old social order, but are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the means of production, meaning that, yes, the property rights of the capitalist class, the bankers and the billionaires, they're going to be eroded upon, right? And it says these measures, of course, will be different in different countries, meaning that there's not a universal road to socialism. The road to socialism in China is going to be very different than the road to socialism in the United States. The road to socialism in Cuba is going to be very different than in Russia. To wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, and these measures will be different in different countries, meaning that we will have socialism with American characteristics. It's going to be a unique form of socialism for the United States, right? And the goal will be to increase, right, to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible, to make society wealthier, to improve the country, to make life better by centralizing production, by planning the economy, by having a government of action that fights for working families. They can centralize production and raise the productive forces, make the country wealthier with rational planning of the economy, right? This is all what Marx wrote. And this is what BreadTube doesn't believe in. They don't believe in a centralized economy. They just want independent worker cooperatives. They don't want to make the country wealthier. They want to make everyone poorer because they think, people have too much stuff and we got to reduce consumption. We got to reduce the population. They don't want to build a mass movement of the working class because they think that's fascism. That's populism. You can't do that. What BreadTube wants and what Marx blatantly called for are pretty contrary to each other. Right? I mean, I'm just reading to you from chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto what Karl Marx wants, and it's very contrary to what these breadtubers want. And if you don't want to take Marx for it, another great book, probably one of the most important books in the history of the Marxist movement after the Communist Manifesto, is called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. It's a very short book written by Friedrich Engels, and I'll read to you what Friedrich Engels says socialism is in that book, right? He says, socialism, right, is the proletariat seizes the public power, seizes control of the government, and by this means transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property, meaning that the banks, factories, and industries and the major centers of economic power belong to the people and not the wealthy few, not the capitalists. And that's the idea, right? The proletariat seizes the public power, and by means of this, transforms the socialized means of production, slipping from the hands of the bourgeoisie into public property. By this act, the proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, and gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes in society thenceforth an anachronism, meaning you raise the amount of wealth in society, and as wealth and abundance in society expands, and wealth no longer walks hand in hand with poverty. People don't get poorer the more wealth is created. As the more wealth is created, the more wealthy society gets. Wealth doesn't create poverty. Abundance does not create poverty. You get rid of that. As a result, society gets wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and then the differences between people fade away. Socialized character is freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan is henceforth possible. The development of production makes the existence of different classes in society thenceforth an anachronism. In proportion as anarchy and social production vanishes, the political authority of the state dies out. Man at last, his own form of socialist organization, becomes the lord over nature, his own master, free. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat, and to thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions and thus the very nature of this act, to impart on the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and meaning of this momentous act, it is called upon to accomplish this task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement, scientific socialism, meaning that the movement of scientific socialism, little red book, the movement of scientific socialism is a movement to make the proletariat aware of its historical mission, of history's challenge, of the drive to rise up and seize control of the means of production, of the drive to take control of the government and have a government that fights for the working class, a working people's government that then takes control of the means of production and organizes the economy to serve public good. And that the scientific socialist movement is about making the proletariat aware of this historic task that they ultimately have. The working class is the majority in society, and ultimately they must lead society to take control of the means of production. This is pretty basic Marxism, but it's absent. It's largely absent. There's all this interest in socialism these days, but these basic concepts are missing. That ultimately it's about building a mass movement of working people around an economic program that will set the stage for reorganizing the economy to serve public good, organizing production upon a predetermined plan, centralizing the instruments of production in the hands of the state, eliminating the anarchy of production. That is ultimately the goal. That is ultimately the goal. And that is what people are missing. That is what people are missing. So I just wanted to share that. This has been kind of a hectic live with me dealing with work stuff on my phone, dealing with work stuff on my phone, and and showing clips and starting later than I thought I was going to do because of technical difficulties. It's been a crazy night. It's a crazy night. Something about springtime. You got your springtime allergies. My face is redder than usual, and all kinds of crazy stuff is happening, but that's all okay, folks. We're a great community. We can get through all kinds of things. You all are very patient. I'm glad you all are here getting through all these crazy times. And I think next, we'll do our roll call, and I'll call you all out as I see you, names and locations, and then I'll just start answering your super chats, and that'll be our show. But you guys have a lot of super chats so far, so I've got a lot of questions to answer before we end tonight's stream. Troy says, it's okay, you're learning from me. Thank you for being patient, folks. Thank you for being patient. I really do appreciate it. So names and locations, folks. I will call you out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Carolyn in Staten Island is with us. Carolyn Conway. Welcome, Carolyn. That's the first name I saw. The first name, right? Is that a Marxist phone? Very funny. But anyway, who else is with us? Scotty and Angie in Miami, David in China, Austin, Texas, Gala, Chaya from Montreal, Lexington, Connecticut, JR in Kalamazoo, Wasea from Wisconsin. Shout out to you. Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn. Los Angeles, Neil Fraser in rainy Hong Kong, Andrew in Australia, Zach in Seattle, Vancouver, Canada, Nathaniel in Washington, Ecuador, Terry in Chicago, South Carolina, San Miguel, Allende in Mexico, Kieran from San Diego, Vancouver, Canada, Troy in Paris of the Plains, Mohsin from Iran, Pumpkin the cat in Pittsburgh, Adam in Las Vegas, Chase in Houston, Marissa in Washington State, Chris in Salt Lake City, Lors in New Orleans, Gabby from Chicity, is that Chicago City? Chicity, Upper Pennsylvania, Michigan, Viking Dave, Zach from Richmond, Virginia, Greece from Greetings from the Greek Communist Party, Joe from Maryland, Michigan, Adrian in New Mexico is with us. Wow, this is wild, folks. This is great. We always have such a great mix of people on these streams. A Better America is out in Michigan. Joe from Maryland, Caitlin and CJ, CPI Chicago. Hello, my friend. Hello to you, Caitlin and CJ, CPI Chicago. Great to meet you. Marlon in San Diego, Joe in Maryland. Very, very good. Cleveland Pirate Alex, Max in DC, who we heard from earlier on the stream, giving an update on events in DC. Quinn and Meredith Anderson. Quinn and Meredith are out there. That's good. Good folks. Ha 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 ha. Oregon. Italian from Bogota. Greetings. Chris from Canada, Detroit, Michigan. Very, very good. Very, very good. All good folks. South Wales, United Kingdom is with us. Very, very good. Morris McKinnon. Good stuff, folks. Good stuff. Good stuff. Anybody else? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Alan in Chicago. Jose Gonzalez in Caracas, Venezuela. St. Louis, Bradley Wasser. Pittsburgh, Twin Cities. Smedley, Chicago, Jason. Very good. Very, very good. Leslie in Queensland. Comrade Christian from Oakland is with us. Very good. Good to have you. Twin Cities, the General Laborer. Pittsburgh. All right. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. All right. So now I'm going to start answering Super Chat questions. If people have more Super Chat questions they want me to answer, now is the time to just shoot me a Super Chat and we'll answer them. Thank you for being here with us. Great. All right. The first Super Chat question is about Daniel DeLeon and George Sorel. Well, those are two individuals, that were both figures in the socialist movement in the 1800s. Daniel DeLeon was a college professor in New York City. I believe he was born, I forget, he was born on an island. He wasn't born in the United States. He was born on an island, I think in the Caribbean. I can't remember which one. But he was a college professor in New York City. He taught at Columbia University, and he was a Marxist. And he supported Henry George. Now, Henry George was this economist who was not a Marxist, but he believed in nationalizing land. Henry George was a popular economist who was kind of a left-wing economist. He was not a Marxist, though. He believed in the nationalization of land and everyone renting from the government. Basically, you would pay land value taxes would be your rent, and the government would be the single landowner. You'd basically rent from the government, using land as the basis of creating a more egalitarian society by having public ownership of land, taxing land values. That was the Henry George economism. Right. And it was the idea was that, if land ownership was concentrated in the hands of the few, it was kind of populist. Right. It wasn't Marxism, but it was kind of a populist movement. Henry George was this economist, and he ran for mayor of New York City. And the Marxists, Karl Marx and his supporters in the United States, supported Henry George when he ran for mayor of New York City. And Henry George, he had a mass movement of support, not just in the United States, but in Britain. In fact, what they call the Liberal Democratic Party in Britain, the Lib Dems, trace their roots back to the Liberal Party, which was the Henry George Party in Britain. So the Georgist movement, and there's a song, the song that was like the theme of the Georgist movement, the Georgist movement's followers of Henry George. They said, the land, God gave to us the land, the ground on which we stand. Why should we be beggars with our ballots in our hand? God gave the land to the people. It was like a mass movement calling for the nationalization of land. So the Marxists strategically supported Henry George. Even though he wasn't a Marxist, they thought he was a progressive. He was fighting against big landowners, big corporations. So they supported Henry George. So this professor, Daniel DeLeon, who was a professor at Columbia University, came out very vocally supporting Henry George. So they fired him from Columbia University for supporting Henry George because they said he was a radical. He was crazy. So he lost his job at Columbia University. So he became this outspoken Marxist agitator after he was fired from Columbia University. And he wrote books about Marxism. He started a newspaper called The Daily People, or The Weekly People. It was The People. And eventually he started what was called the Socialist Labor Party, which was the first mass Marxist party in the United States, the SLP, the Socialist Labor Party. And Daniel DeLeon went around the United States preaching socialism. And he played a very important role in making socialism popular in the United States. And he was this intellectual, this college professor who'd been fired for his political stance, and he basically became the voice of socialism. And he would run for president and run for different offices around the United States on a socialist platform. He was arrested a number of times, and he was just a mass socialist agitator, Daniel de Leon. Daniel de Leon was a little bit of an ultra leftist. Some of his views were so extreme that they kind of cut him off from the masses of people. For example, at the time in the United States, there were these things called trusts, right? The trusts were big conglomerates of big corporations, right? These big financial monopolies, banks and oil companies and manufacturers would get together in trusts. And there was a widespread movement against the trusts. They felt the trusts were hurting the country. And Daniel de Leon, he said that the trusts were good because then it'll make it easier for the after the revolution, it'll be easier for the workers to seize the means of production. And that was kind of a wacky stance. If you have a group of working people who are organizing and resisting against big monopoly corporations, you don't go around and say, well, actually, those corporations are good because after we have the revolution, it'll be easier. That's kind of an ultra leftist position. He also was pretty much opposed to labor unions. He argued that basically socialism is the answer, not labor unions. And so basically, he was a founding member of the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, but because the Wobblies wanted to actually organize strikes and protests and such, they didn't just want to be preaching socialism all day. He was eventually kicked out of the Wobblies. So Daniel de Leon was a little bit ultra left. He was more about just kind of screaming socialism from the heavens. He didn't really want to build a mass movement of working people to rise up and seize control of the means of production. He kind of was a little bit of an ultra left, but at the same time, he played a very, very important role. Eugene Debs discovered Marxism through followers of Daniel de Leon. William Z. Foster discovered Marxism through followers of Daniel de Leon. And Daniel de Leon, his followers, the Socialist Labor Party, the de Leonites, they went around the United States preaching socialism from every podium and every soapbox, and that was what they did. And that was a very important thing. So he was very much a hero of American history. His role was largely positive. There's room for some criticism of Daniel de Leon, though. And ultimately, he died, but his followers ultimately turned against the Russian Revolution and didn't support the Russian Revolution. In some ways, they were a little bit, ultra left. But ultimately, Daniel de Leon was a progressive figure in American politics. He popularized socialism and Marxism in the United States, and he went to jail at different points. He lost his job at different points. He certainly suffered and made a great contribution, and he's a very admirable figure. Now, George Sorel is a very different figure. George Sorel was in France, and George Sorel was a French intellectual, and he was part of what they called the revisionist school of Marxism. So you have to fast forward, right? So Karl Marx is dead. After Karl Marx died, will Europe suffer as gas sold in rubles to Europe? Karl Marx died, and after Karl Marx's death, Marxism and socialism became very popular. The labor movement took off. You started having labor unions in many different, parts of Europe. You had mass labor movements. Socialists got elected to parliaments, and you started to have a mass socialist movement. And the socialist movement was really, really expanding. And, you had socialist marching bands and socialist choirs, and socialism was all over Europe in like the 1880s, 1890s, 1910, up in the lead up to World War I, you had this mass socialist movement. And it was massive and it was huge, and all these working people were becoming socialists. But you didn't have a revolution. You didn't really have a revolution. None of these countries did the workers rise up and seize control of their factories. None of these countries did you have, Marxism is predicated on the idea that workers will eventually rise up and take control of their factories and seize the means of production, but it didn't happen. So why did it not happen? And that was what they called the first crisis of Marxism. Why did Europe in the 1880s and the 1890s not have a socialist revolution? Why? Well, Lenin said that it was because of imperialism. It was because the big corporations and monopolies, the big banks and corporations and trusts and syndicates, the big monopolies and financial interests in the Western capitalist countries started carving out the world. They expanded across the planet. And they started super exploiting countries in the developing world. And, because they were able to do that, because they were able to start super exploiting countries in the developing world, because of that, they were able to start paying some of the workers in the homeland a higher wage, right? Because the capitalists, they were super exploiting countries all over the world. They were making not just regular profits, but super profits. They could afford to start paying some of the more skilled workers in the homeland higher wages. And so some sections of the working class started to see their living standard go up as a result of imperialism, right? And that laid the basis for the aristocracy of labor, which is sections of the working class who were seeing their living standard go up at the same time that imperialism was in ascension. And because of that, they became less revolutionary. And in the United States, you had the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And this was a labor union, the Labor Union Federation, that was run by labor aristocrats. It was run by the crafts guilds, right? Unions that you couldn't just, not anyone could join it. You had to go through an apprenticeship, like plumbers and pipe fitters and bricklaying masons and others, right? And those workers, increasingly, because they were seeing their living standard go up, they argued basically that U.S. imperialism was good. It was good the USA was taking over the Philippines. It was good the USA was taking over Cuba. It was good that the British Empire was colonizing Africa because it was leading to their living standard going up. And increasingly, they saw lower income workers as not their allies. They were with the bosses against lower income workers. If there were a group of factory workers who were on strike, they'd say, demanding a union, they'd say, no, they shouldn't have a union. They're not skilled workers like us. And their unions banned workers who weren't born in the United States, banned workers who couldn't speak English, banned workers who were African American, who were not white, or who were Roman Catholic in some cases, right? And so you saw this division, this division, this stratification of the working class because of imperialism. And Lenin understood that. And Lenin wrote his very important book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, saying that capitalism had moved on from the industrial stage to the monopoly stage. It had become imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, capitalist monopolistic rule over the planet, capitalism in its monopoly stage. So that was what was behind the crisis of Marxism. That's why you weren't having socialist revolutions in France and Germany and the United States and Britain, countries like that, because you had the rise of an aristocracy of labor, and this was actually hurting the revolutionary movement. So that was what Lenin understood. But there were other reactions to the crisis of Marxism. And so one form of the crisis of Marxism, one reaction to it, was the rise of what they called the revisionist school. And that was people that said there's something wrong with the Marxist theory, basically. You had the official Marxist movement, the Second International, the Socialist International, and then you had other people that called themselves Marxists, but were saying we need to revise aspects of Marxism because clearly it's not working. The main revisionist was a guy named Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein, he coined the term revisionism, and he said, well, the issue is, he said, the reason we're not having revolutions is you don't need one. He said the workers can just outvote the capitalists. There are more workers than there are capitalists. We now have universal male suffrage. I think it's hilarious, right? No one even thought about giving women the right to vote, but they had universal male suffrage, so every man could vote. And because every man can vote, there's more working class men than there are capitalist men. So eventually the workers will outvote the capitalists, and we'll have socialism. And Edward Bernstein said the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. Meaning that it's not about having a revolution. It's just about gradual day-to-day reforms, right? And that he said that the problem with Marxism is Marxism says there's just going to be this big revolution and it's a struggle to seize control of the state. No, that's wrong. It's just a question of day-to-day reforms. He said socialism is nothing but the sum of reforms, right? So that was the primary thinking among the revisionists, right? And they basically argued that capitalism in the West, in the United States, and Britain, and France, and Germany, was just sort of naturally turning into socialism every day. The movement is everything, but the goal is nothing, right? That's what they believed, and that socialism is just the sum of reforms. But they weren't the only voice within the revisionist school of Marxism. One of the other voices in the revisionist school of Marxism was George Sorel. And George Sorel was a French intellectual. And he argued not that the problem was that you just kind of gradually have reform. He argued the opposite. George Sorel argued that the problem with Marxism was that it tried to build a mass movement by building mass labor unions, by building mass community associations, by getting, socialists elected to parliament, by building these movements of millions of people, that this was leading to the revolutionary side of Marxism being watered down. In order to build a group that has so many people in it, you can't have fanaticism. And he argues that history is not made by mass groups of people, it's made by fanatics. And that it's fanaticism and the desire of fanatics to engage in heroism. He really emphasizes heroism. The desire of fanatics to engage in heroism. This is what changes history. He divides society. He says you have the decadent rich, the fat and rich, and then you have the stupid masses, the people that are just, too stupid to be political, the sheeple or whatever. But then you have this small group of people, the violent fanatics, the heroic ones, and they're men. This group of men who desire to become heroic. He draws from Plato and Socrates. He talks about the philosopher kings. And he says, instead of trying to build a mass movement among the broad masses of people that he calls the sheeple, we need to build a fanatical group, a fanatical cult, basically, a group of very violent, heroic men who will engage in violence and will inspire other people with their violence. And that's Sorelianism. And Sorel was a syndicalist, basically. And he argued that the problem with the Marxist movement, the reason you had the crisis of Marxism, was a spiritual problem, because Marxism was not tapping in to the emotions and the spiritual power of these kind of groups of fanatics who engage in violence and heroism. That's what Sorel is arguing. If you can read Reflections on Violence by George Sorel, that's the main book of his. But there's other books of his writings where he basically makes this argument. And so he's arguing that basically instead of building a mass movement, you need to build a group of violent fanatics, right? And that he also talks about the power of myth. That's a big part of Sorelianism, right? Is that syndicalists, right, labor union activists, believed they would go around saying someday there's going to be a great general strike. They're going to have the great general strike where one day all the workers of the world are going to go on strike and they're going to rise up and take control of their factories. And, George Sorel says, what are the chances that one day there's going to be one big general strike for the whole world? Not very high, but it doesn't matter because it's a myth, right? This is the myth. It's a myth, and this myth will motivate people to do great things. And he argues, he says, look, Christianity, he says, Jesus may not have ever existed, he argues. The Bible is clearly not true, but look at all the great empires and great civilization in Europe. It's been built on the myth of Christianity, and that myths are very important. If you motivate people with myths, they go out and do heroic things. So George Sorel is basically saying, in response to the crisis of Marxism, that we need to build a mass movement we need to build not a mass movement, but an isolated group of fanatics that engage in violence and are motivated by the power of myth. That's Sorelianism. And George Sorel increasingly took socialist politics in a more conservative and right-wing direction based on the power of myth. For example, he supported the monarchy. He was a member of a French monarchist party. And why was he a member of this monarchist party? Because he believed that the love of the king and the spiritual power and the emotions that French people attached to the monarchy could lead them to go out and fight and have the revolution and overturn capitalism. Benito Mussolini said that he owed everything in life to George Sorel. And, Sorelianism largely became a fascist movement. I mean, Sorel died. He died in 1922. At the time of his death, George Sorel admired Lenin and Mussolini. And he argued that both of them, both Lenin and Mussolini, had proved that his theory that you need this violent group of heroic men was right. He said that Lenin's theory of the vanguard party and the party of new type was an incarnation of his idea, and Mussolini's fascisti, that they were an incarnation of his idea. And that, yes, and Shaya is right. Sorel did have an impact on the left as well as the right. He was a thinker, and some things he was right about and some things he was wrong about. I mean, I think his critique of the Marxist movement is largely psychological. He's basically arguing that because Marxism is so materialistic, right? It's all about economics, people working in their own economic interest, that you can't just go around to people and get them to just work in their economic interest. That there is history is made by people like Che Guevara. Che Guevara was from a very wealthy family, but he realized that the world was unjust, and he went out and he sacrificed and gave his life to fight for the poor, and he didn't have to. And that that appealing to people's spiritual desires, appealing to people's desire to become heroic, appealing to people's feelings of loyalty to their country or their family, that has an impact. That's correct. The fetishization of violence is absolutely disgusting, though, and it's very middle class, right? The belief that violence is this empowering thing. I'm sorry, talk to a war veteran sometime. War veterans, anyone who's been a combat veteran who's actually been in war will tell you that's not the case. People come home with PTSD, they're destroyed, and the fetishization of violence is a very middle class deviation. Working people don't want violence in their communities. Working people don't want violence in their homes, in their neighborhoods. If you go around telling people you want to make the country, you want to have a big civil war in the country, no one's going to listen to you. So he's dead wrong on that. That's a very middle class intellectual, and he was this middle class French intellectual of the syndicalist and revisionist Marxist school. His admiration for monarchism and trying to go back to the monarchy. In a lot of ways, he was right wing, and he was a big inspiration for fascism. But there are some aspects of what he said that were important. I think he's right in his spiritual critique of Marxism. I think that, and if you look at the socialist countries of today, if you look at China, if you look at Cuba, there is a spiritual power to what they're doing. It's not simply, Fidel doesn't get on TV. When Fidel Castro would get on TV and give his May Day speech, he didn't just get on there and say, everybody work in your economic interest. I am going to make you somewhat richer. No, he did appeal to people on an emotional level. So it's complicated, but that's George Sorel. So, ultimately, I view George Sorel in a negative light. I see him as a negative figure. But there are some aspects of his critique that is justified, but his answers were wrong. And he's largely a negative figure, but he's worth knowing about. I would argue that a lot of the left in the United States, the new left, groups that come out of the 1960s, are more or less Sorelian. The Revolutionary Communist Party, take the Maoists, the Bobavakian people, they are completely Sorelian. With them, it is not about economics. It's not about overproduction. It's not about capitalist profits. With them, it's all about the government is oppressing people, but we're going to be revolutionary. We're going to be heroic. They're always screaming the F word. They burn the American flag. And when we come to power, it's all this emotional, spiritual, emotional, angry, violent rhetoric, right? And that is that's very Sorelian. A lot of the new left groups, a lot of the new left, people see a big influence of Sorelianism on the work of Franz Fanon, who was a big new left 1960s name, right? Franz Fanon and his psychological writings, right? I believe Franz Fanon, he wrote The Wretched of the Earth, and that Franz Fanon, there's a lot of Sorelian influence on his work. Propaganda of the deed, right? That's a big anarchist term. A lot of like ultra-left terrorist groups that engage in terrorism. They will argue, they say, well, that if we go out and commit this act of violence, that'll inspire people, right? That's a very Sorelian way of thinking, and it's also very wrong, right? Lenin does a great job just ripping to shreds the notion of propaganda of the deed. The idea that you're going to commit some act of violence, some big act of violence, and then the masses are going to see that and rise up. No, it's the opposite. If the masses see, that revolutionaries are going around doing violent things, that's going to isolate the revolutionaries from the masses. It's going to lead to the masses turning to the state for protection. It's going to lead to the masses rallying around the state. So propaganda of the deed as a concept that Sorel kind of embraced, that is very much a deviation and incorrect, but it's very Sorelian, this belief that violence has this power to inspire people. So that's my thoughts on George Sorel. Again, those are both, you asked me about two figures, right? And it was a very long answer. But there you go. You explain the role of both of those people. Both of those people, Daniel de Leon and George Sorel, are very important in the history of Marxism, but they're also, it's very complex. These are not simple answers. All right. Symbolism of the rocket ship in the CPI intro. I believe in space travel. The Soviet Union invented space travel, advancing the human species beyond the planet. The idea that we can capture the energy and the power to go to Mars and get resources from asteroids. China and their space program, and how they're acquiring helium-3 from the moon because they believe in helium energy. This is all very, very exciting stuff. And this is all very, very good. So I'm excited about the space program. I believe in the space program. I believe in historical progress. So I guess that's what it symbolizes: the advance of humanity, etc. There you go. How did former socialist countries join NATO? Well, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, almost all of the formerly socialist countries of the Eastern Bloc were dominated by pro-US political forces. Russia, you had Boris Yeltsin, who came in and sold the country off to the highest bidder. Ukraine had various, free market neoliberal regimes imposed on it. The biggest exception is probably Belarus. In Belarus, you did have Alexander Lukashenko, who did not privatize state industries, rejected shock therapy economics, and maintained a social safety net. And that's why Belarus, in terms of living conditions and life expectancy, did much better than the surrounding countries during the 1990s. But for the most part, most countries in the former Soviet Union became dominated by Western capitalism. Georgia is just a complete puppet of Western capitalism. Georgia, many of the former countries. And so joining NATO is a way of doing it. The other thing is that the United States made a point of empowering anti-Russian nationalists in those countries. There were a lot of fascists and anti-Russian nationalists who the United States empowered. For example, in Poland, right? A lot of people know about the Solidarity movement in Poland. It was this movement in Poland among dock workers, like a labor union that was anti-communist and dominated by Roman Catholics. What people don't know is that the Solidarity Union, a lot of the leaders of it, were anti-Semitic. They hated Jews. And they believed communism was some kind of Jewish conspiracy against capitalism, right? Ukraine, right now, the United States is working with the Azov Battalion. This is an extremist, fanatical, Nazi sympathizing group that admires Stepan Bandera, right? And that part of the United States working to bring down the Soviet Union was empowering nationalistic folks who hate Russians on an ethnic level and have a more or less pro-Hitler narrative of World War II, tend to be very anti-Semitic and such. And so those forces, because they're anti-Russian, they would obviously sympathize with joining NATO. So, I hope that answers your question. But yeah, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, even though Russia was promised that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward, that was James Baker who promised that to Russia. German foreign ministers made the similar promise after Germany reunified. Even though that was happening, you did have the United States expanding NATO. NATO has vastly expanded right up to Russia's border, and it's a threat on Russia because NATO has always been an anti-Russian alliance. All right, next question. Do you plan on streaming full time? No, I do not. I'm a reporter. I'm doing reporting. I'm doing it, from my home. I'm reporting for RT International. You can watch my reporting if you go to Rumble. RT's banned from YouTube, but you can watch my reporting on Rumble. You can watch it at RT.com if you click live. I'm also writing articles. I've also, I have different ways of getting by, but streaming full time is not my current situation. And I also I'll just use this opportunity. I want to apologize to Patreons, right? I wasn't able to do a stream for the Patreons at the beginning of this month. Beginning of this month, we had the Austin conference. And then, with the ongoing war in Ukraine and everything going on, I haven't had a chance to stream for the Patreon. So, I'm going away this weekend. A friend of mine's getting married. And when I get back into town, we're going to do a patrons only stream, and we're going to figure out, I owe my patrons, right? And I do apologize to anyone who's watching as part of the Patreon community. Please don't feel neglected. I think about everything the Center for Political Innovation has done over the last year. We have moved mountains, folks. We have moved mountains. That conference we had in Austin, Texas, shook the world. Okay, that conference that we did in the middle of America, in the heartland, in Texas, with threats from ultra leftists and threats from bread tubers and threats from anarchists and all kinds of security concerns and all kinds of different things. We came together, and in the middle of an anti-Russian hysteria, a full mobilization of the population against Russia, we had a pro-Russian anti-imperialist conference. Jackson Hinkle gave a speech. Haas gave a speech. Peter Coffin and Miss Astronaut Cowboy Doctor gave a speech. We're still posting some of the speeches. Lily gave a great speech about Alex Saab. David Cedillo gave a great speech about Nicaragua. It was a phenomenal conference, and we got, the whole place was full. Well over 100 people were there. It was a huge, huge endeavor. And in the atmosphere that we were in, there was Muhammad, a local Shia Muslim, who came in and he gave a speech. It was an amazing feat. And we just continue to do what we're doing. We have National Days of Action for Alex Saab. We're doing one, this weekend. There's going to be people in the streets all over the country for Alex Saab. And we did that, a month ago. We had people in the streets for Alex Saab. And it is amazing what we have been able to accomplish. And now, that conference that we did, it got us on the Jimmy Dore show. I'll be real about that. I don't know, but I feel like the fact that we were able to have that conference, and pull that off in the atmosphere that we pulled it off in. Financially, it was very stressful. Please come back to Austin. Oh, yes, we plan on it. And thank you, Gala. And it was great meeting you at the conference. And, and the fact that we pulled that off, opinions on realist international relations theory, I don't know enough about that. I can't comment on that. The fact that we pulled that off when we did, that was very amazing. And then that conference got us on the Jimmy Dore show. We were on the Jimmy Dore show. This community got on the Jimmy Dore show. We were on the Jimmy Dore show. Our book, Bread Tube Serves Imperialism, we did a whole segment with Jimmy Dore about it. We talked about Ukraine with Jimmy Dore. That was a huge breakthrough for our community. People are acknowledging us. That conference, Max Blumenthal sent us greetings. George Galloway sent us greetings. Tara Reid sent us greetings. We are marching ahead at full speed. They are freaking out. They're making all kinds of crazy hit piece documentaries trying to demonize us. They are like going crazy because we're actually doing this, folks. We are building a real community. We are trying to figure out and get things together to do another conference in Chicago very soon. At this point, we're still waiting. And until we get the finances together, we have to see if we can do it. If we can't get the donations and the finances together, we can't do it. But if we can do it, we're going to do it. One thing that is for sure is we are having our national gathering this summer. And it'll be in the heartland of America. We're thinking Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, someplace like that. We're looking at various locations. And we are having our national gathering June 22nd through 26th. So if you are a member of the Center for Political Innovation, if you've signed up and you're a member and you are able to come, pretty soon, once we have the location and all of that, we're going to open up spots for our national gathering. It'll be a four-day communist summer camp in the countryside, basically, where we will learn, we'll have classes, we'll socialize and bond. It is going to be amazing. June 22nd through 26th. So mark your calendar for that if you are somebody who wants to be part of that. It's going to be a 4-day national gathering. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be utterly awesome. We're doing amazing stuff right now. This community is marching ahead, and people, the amount of people who've joined the Center for Political Innovation, the amount of people that are reaching out and want more information, this is a real working class movement. And we're not calling for violent revolution. We're not trying to destroy the country. We're patriotic. We love our community. We love our country. And we say the only way to make things better is with socialism. That's what we are trying to do. We're trying to build a socialist community, trying to build a socialist society. We're putting forward rational policy solutions, public ownership of oil and natural gas, public control of the banking system, a mass jobs program to rebuild the country, an economic bill of rights like Roosevelt called for, fusion energy and cooperating with Russia and China for fusion energy, a mass program to cooperate to rebuild Central America as a way of dealing with the crisis on our border. We are putting forward real policy solutions to save the United States from the unfolding crisis created by the greed of the bankers and corporations. And that's what scares these people. This isn't a negativity. This isn't doomerism. And, one thing about the conference, I mean, it went on pretty late into the night. It was almost midnight by the time we left, right? That clip that some of the people who don't like us are showing of people of Nick and Char Char Darling marching out with the flags. People like look at that and they're like, "Oh, the crowd is very small." Yeah, because it was almost midnight by the time we wrapped up. Okay, the conference started at 1, doors opened at 1, and we weren't out of there until midnight. That was a long ass event. And yeah, but towards the end of that event, there just was this glow in the room. You had to be there. People really felt like this is the community where I belong. I mean, once the second panel got going, and every speech was followed by a standing ovation and chanting and people hugging, and it was just an atmosphere of like, if you really have love in your heart and you really want to build a rational socialist society, and you're tired of being a hater, and you're tired of tearing things down, and you really just want to build a rational society where the people come first, if you really love your community and love your country and want international friendship and cooperation, you don't want World War III, you don't want to cancel people and tear them down, you really, really have an optimistic, constructive socialist attitude, CPI is just like coming home. So many people have said, I feel like I belong in this group. This is where I belong. This is the community I've been looking for. A lot of the people who hate us don't ever go outside, and they don't ever do anything, and they just sit around and they live in this downward spiral of negativity, And you know what? Here's the thing. I'll just tell you this, and you can take this however you want to take it. If you're one of those people, if you're one of these fans of Thought Slime, Skippy the Bear, right? He's all about negativity, one of the most vicious negative people. If you're one of the people hating on us right now and all that, I want to tell you something, right? I want to tell you something. We will forgive you. I mean, I'm just telling you this, and this may sound weird. We will forgive you. If part of you just is longing to be part of a community, and part of you deep down is tired of sitting around and smoking weed and looking at porn and hating your relatives and hating your neighborhood and hating your community, and if part of you just really, really wants a new life, it doesn't matter if you've talked shit against us on the internet, if you've bashed us up and down and said we're evil and we're fascists, if you've been a Vosh fan or a Destiny fan, we will forgive you. We will. And if you one day you just have an awakening and you change your mind and you say, I want to leave my negative life behind, I want to be a positive person again, I want to be part of something good, we will forgive you. You don't have to come around and pretend and be like, oh, and be terrified that we're going to, find out about it. You don't have to think, well, I used to bash them. So that's the thing. A lot of these people, I think Peter Coffin, he pointed out, no one ever admits they're wrong on the internet. No one ever admits they're wrong, right? I mean, and that's one of these things that drives me crazy, because it's like, there's all this negative propaganda out there against us. But if you watch these streams for like 2 seconds, you'll know that we're not racist. We're a multiracial, multi-gender organization. There's plenty of LGBT folks in our organization, plenty of Muslim folks, plenty of Jewish folks, plenty of atheist and Christian folks. We're obviously not what our detractors claim. We're not advocates of a theocracy like Jason Unruhe claims. We're just a group of people who believe in socialism, but an optimistic, hopeful kind, not a negative, hateful, destructive kind, okay? We love our community, we love our country, and we want a socialism that can actually win and can actually improve things. That's what we want. And, that's what we are. And no one on the internet ever wants to admit they're wrong. Look, I don't blame you. If all you'd ever seen was one of these hit pieces by Skippy the Bear or Vosh or Sophie from Mars or Red Planet Venus or whatever the hell, you might think that. That's okay. Those people are liars. And you didn't know that they were liars. But if you come around and you see that we're not what you've been told we are, there's nothing shameful, absolutely nothing shameful about going, you know what? I got tricked. I got hoodwinked. We're not going to be like, oh, see, you were wrong. No. Hell, we're going to be happy that you did real investigation and real work and dug into the facts and found out the truth for yourself. We're going to be happy with you for doing that. We're going to be happy with you. And on top of that, we're going to welcome you with open arms. It's okay to be wrong. I've been wrong. I've been wrong. My political history, I was in one group, I was in another group, and here I am. I look back at some of the things that I've said over the course of my political life. I really regret them. I was dead wrong in multiple instances. I'm not going to get on in great detail about it, but I've been dead wrong before. You know, that's okay. And if you are somebody who just, you know, there's part of you that's just longing to be part of our community, but you just don't want to admit you were wrong. You've got this pride. You're like, oh, wow, I called them Nazbols. I called them Red Browns. And you don't have to hold on to that. You can let it go. And we will forgive you. And we will welcome you into our organization with open arms. We will welcome you into our organization with open arms. We are all about forgiveness, right? This is not a virtue signaling competition. There are people in our group who used to be conservatives. There are people in our group who used to be vicious anti-communists. You know, we are not a group of people that we're not trying to get revenge on you. We're not trying to call you out for being wrong. If one day there's just a voice inside of your head that says, you know what, this is too negative. This is too negative. This is too hateful. This is too destructive. And I just don't want to go down a sinking ship, right? It's like, there's a lot of negative people. And I talked to a lot of people about how they left the doomerism and how they became an optimistic socialist. And a lot of them said, Caleb, I was into thought slime. I was into Vosh. All right, we'll talk about what that means, Peter, right? I was into thought slime. I was into Vosh. But there was just something inside of me. There's something inside of me pushing the other way. There was this voice in the back of my head that was saying, I don't have to be this negative. And if you choose to listen to that voice, you really choose to listen to that voice, we're not going to hold against you what you did in the past. We're going to welcome you. We're going to welcome you. And we're going to say, thank God, because that's half of our organization. Half of our organization are people who used to be doomers, used to be anarchids, used to be bread tube type leftists, and something in them, something within them woke them up. And they heard our broadcasts. And they said, I can go another way. I don't have to be a destructive, hateful, resentful, hopeless, isolated person. I can change. I can do something different. I can believe in socialism. I can struggle for the working class, but I don't have to do it in a hateful, destructive way. And they turned around. And we can talk about why that is, right? Now, some people, it's directly related to the issue of substance abuse. I never tell anyone's business, but there's a fair number of people in our group who had an issue with alcohol, had an issue with drugs. And part of their political awakening, coming to constructive, optimistic socialism and the city building tendency, and, was also their awakening of getting off drugs, which is very beautiful and very amazing. But ultimately, there is something within the human species that is a will to live. A will to live, right? Life seeks to preserve itself. Human beings have a drive to survive. I don't know if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, right? But in Jurassic Park, one of the big lines in the movie is life found a way. Life always finds a way, right? And it's human beings, as much as adverse as the circumstances are, human beings are inventors, they're tool makers, and there's just something within the human species that wants to keep going. It's very difficult for human beings to commit suicide. Did you know that? It's actually quite difficult. There's a lot of people who attempt suicide but aren't able to pull it off because everything within you, your instinct, pushes you not to do it, right? It's very hard for people to kill themselves. Very, very difficult, right? Now, people obviously can do it. But but it's often very hard. People that are very depressed, very suicidal, they can't kill themselves. And the reason they can't do it is because of this inner drive to survive. There is this inner drive to survive that human beings have. And for a lot of people, giving up BreadTube, giving up pessimistic, degrowth, destructive, slime socialism, and instead embracing the city building tendency, that is what awakens that will to live that they have. And that is beautiful to me. And this experience that people have described to me of the day that they woke up, the day that they turned around, and the day that they didn't stop being a socialist. They didn't become a blind believer in capitalism. They didn't start supporting imperialist wars. No, they figured out that there's a way to be a socialist and not be a doomer. There's a way to be a socialist and not be a pessimistic, resentful, hateful, isolated person. There's a way to be a constructive socialist. That day was the day that changed their life. I mean, it really was. And again, we can offer that here. And when you do that, you're really choosing your own survival. You're choosing your own survival at that point. You're saying the self-destructive part of me, the part of me that wants to kill me, the negative, hopeless, destructive part of me, I'm going to override it. I'm going to find my own inner strength. But here's the thing, and here's the thing that no one ever tells you, right? We live in such an individualist society that people forget that you're not supposed to be able to do it alone. Did you know that? You're not supposed to be able to do it alone. The reason that so many people are depressed, the reason the pandemic took such a psychological toll on so many young people is because they had to do it alone. My family, my parents used to always say to me, be positive, have a good attitude. I used to hate that when I was a kid. I'd think, oh my God, if I'm in a bad mood, I can be in a bad mood. Don't tell me how to feel, right? Don't tell me how to feel. Don't make me be optimistic. Don't make me be positive. But there's a reason that you have a duty to be positive. There's a reason that you have a duty to smile at your coworkers when you arrive at the office. There's a reason that you have a duty to, be nice to your family members. And the reason is that you being optimistic and you being positive makes it easier for them to be optimistic and makes it easier for them to be positive. If you're in a room with other people who are being positive, it's much easier for you to be positive. And then it's much easier for them to be positive. And then it's much easier for you to be positive. And that human beings feed off of each other's positivity. This is just a psychological fact. If people around you are being positive, you will be positive. And it's much easier for you to be positive if you're around other people who are being positive than it is for you to be positive on your own. It's very difficult to be positive on your own. If you're isolated, if you're not talking to anybody, if you're, just alone at home, doing class online, it's very hard to remain positive. Isolation is a big feeder of depression and hopelessness, believe it or not. And human beings depend on each other's. People depend on each other's optimism. And being in a group of people is a way that people can support each other. And so if you want to remain optimistic and you want to remain constructive and you want to keep your energy going and you want to keep on a good path, you want to keep exercising and you want to keep, looking forward to tomorrow and you want to keep, accomplishing things, the best way to do it is to be in a group of other people that are doing roughly the same thing. Right? That's how it works. Right? And and I realized that on some level, that's why I became a socialist, right? I was never happy to just read about socialism. I always had to be in a group, right? I always had to be in a group. And what was frustrating is a lot of the groups that I was with were a lot of old folks who were very negative, a lot of boomer leftists who were disappointed about the fall of the Soviet Union, disappointed about the way the world has been. And that's not the kind of energy I wanted. But every so often, even in this socialist group I used to be in, the Workers' World Party, every so often I would see what they used to be. It was actually kind of sad. It was very sad. And this is a long answer to a question, and I got a lot more super chats to get to, but I'll just say this. It was very sad in a way, but it right after Occupy Wall Street, when Occupy Wall Street happened, they didn't have very many young members. I was like one of their only young members in the city at the time. But because Occupy Wall Street had happened, and it was this populist, anti-corporate movement, all of a sudden, this wave of energy flowed through the group. And suddenly the office was full of people, all the old people that had just kind of become inactive and maybe sent a donation once a year or went to a forum. All of a sudden, they were at the office every day. Now, all these older folks were remembering what it was like to be an activist in the 60s and march against the Vietnam War. And they were suddenly full of optimism. And all the infighting that had gone on in that group, a lot of infighting and people throwing mud at each other, just kind of evaporated temporarily. And all of a sudden, everyone was working hard. And we were kind of wanting Occupy Wall Street to have the demand of Occupy for jobs, right? We wanted Occupy Wall Street to demand the right to employment. And so suddenly we just started building our own like front for Occupy Wall Street called, Northern Hemisphere and not over the edge of optimism. I don't know what that means, but suddenly we were building our own wing of Occupy Wall Street called Occupy for Jobs. And all the infighting just kind of evaporated. And all of a sudden, the office was full of people every day. And we were working to build our Occupy for Jobs movement. And all these people were just full of this optimism. And suddenly it was like, this is the machine worked. And that's what the group was like in the 70s and even in the 80s, I think. And that's not what the group was like when I was in it. When I was in the group, it was a very old and tired and lonely group. But and there were a couple times too, where that optimism, that energy, I saw it. And that's what makes people be socialists. You would talk to some of these old socialists, and it's like every time you talk to them, 1968 comes up. It's kind of sad. But it's like, every time you talk to them, every conversation gets back to 1968. And when I was your age, back in 1968, the Black Panthers, why are they talking that way? Why does every conversation get back to 1968? Because 1968 gave them that feeling. They were part of a group. They were organizing. They were struggling. They were doing something. It wasn't an intellectual exercise. It wasn't a vague idea. It was they were part of a group. They were organizing. They were getting something done. Right? They were working together to accomplish a goal. This gives people purpose, right? This really, really gives people purpose. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. If you're an internet socialist and you're not happy, there's a way out of that. Get involved. Get involved in the Center for Political Innovation. We have our Zoom calls every week. We have our weekly Zoom calls. We have locals around the country, California Organizing Committee. We got New York City, we got a local in DC. You just heard from Max the Sax. If you are looking for a way out of the downward spiral, there is a way out, and we can offer that to you. And you don't have to, you don't have to be stuck in your pride. It's not like we're going to say, oh, you used to bash us. No, it's not like that. You can just say, you know what, I was wrong. And you're going to feel better when you admit that you were wrong, by the way. Sometimes I think the people who hate me the most, I've thought this for a million years, are the people who kind of agree with me. Because it's like I will get comments. I will read my YouTube comments. Some people say you should never read your YouTube comments. I do. Unfortunately, I read my YouTube comments. And you'll get people, it'll be like midnight, and they'll comment on like 16 different videos of mine. And it'll be like an angry, hateful comment. And I know what that is they're watching my stuff, and part of them agrees with me. Part of them agrees with me. But they it just makes them so angry. Just makes them so angry because they know there's part of them that's agreeing with me, and they have to kill that part of themselves that agrees with me. They have to shut it down. They got to silence it. And so they're going through all my videos and going, yeah, well, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, and they're trying to they're not shouting at me. They're not shouting at me. They are not shouting at me. They're shouting at the voice inside their head that's saying, well, he's actually kind of right about this. He's actually kind of right. He's kind of got a point there. And they're going, oh no, I can't. And that's what they're really angry about. Just saying. I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what they're really angry about. And it scares them. It scares them. It scares people. But anyway, enough about that. We got a lot more to get through. All right. I am. Why was Gramsci covertly supported? Well, Gramsci himself wasn't covertly supported. Antonio Gramsci was a leader of the Italian Communist Party. Mussolini put him in jail. In prison, he wrote the prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci, and he focused on the culture struggle, and the struggle, in the arts and in the academia and in the sciences. The prison notebooks of Antonio Gramsci. They were not published until the 60s. I think in the 1960s they published them. There was an effort to emphasize Gramsci's writings during the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And part of that was because, during the rise of the new left, there was an emphasis on Gramsci for a couple reasons. The first of which is that Gramsci's prison notebooks are written in code. Gramsci was in prison, and because he was in prison, he could not write Marxism and dialectical materialism and class struggle and the Soviet Union and the proletariat. He couldn't write that, because if he did, the prison censors would rip it up. So he had to write in code. And so he referred to Marxism as the theory of praxis, right? And the prison censors are reading this. The theory of praxis. Okay, whatever. It doesn't make any sense. They wouldn't censor it. So it's written in code. It's not, you can read Gramsci and you're not going to get communism from Gramsci. In fact, a lot of people in academia laugh. I mean, I've known Marxist academics who laugh about it. A lot of people don't know Gramsci was a communist. Gramsci was the leader of the Italian Communist Party. But, I get people who say, no, he couldn't have been. They quote him in my college sociology class. They quote him in my college anthropology class. They quoted him in my political science class. He couldn't be a Marxist. He couldn't be a communist. Communists are bad. Gramsci was a communist. He was a Stalinist, right? He was a Stalinist communist. He was in the Italian Communist Party when Stalin was in power. Supposedly not confirmed. He was saying critical things of Stalin or something, but there's no proof of that. Right? And he wrote these prison notebooks, but he wrote them in code. So you can quote them and you don't sound like you're quoting a communist. It doesn't have like Marxist terminology in it. That's one thing. Number two, his notebooks focus on the culture struggle. The culture struggle. That's a big part of what they focus on, is the cultural struggle, not the labor movement, not the struggle to change government policy, not the policies of the Communist International, but rather how art and culture influence people. That's really a lot of what he's writing about. And because of that, when you're focusing on cultural issues, the Frankfurt School, right? Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, those folks that were covertly supported by American intelligence very blatantly. I mean, Herbert Marcuse had been, an employee of the Office of War Information. And then he went back to Germany after the Second World War, and they were printing him in the CIA magazine, the CIA-funded magazine Der Monat. I mean, he was completely, and the same with Adorno, the same with Sontag, and these people. But their whole thing, it was about the cultural issues. And it was a vague critique of mass marketing, a vague critique of capitalism. But it's not about building a mass workers' movement. And Herbert Marcuse, in his book One Dimensional Man, went as far as arguing that the intellectuals and not the proletariat would make the revolution. The proletariat was not revolutionary, only the intellectuals were. So these folks, they could really appreciate Gramsci because it's focusing on the culture struggle. I have the prison notebooks, by the way. I've read some of it. I haven't read all of it. There's all kinds of stuff in there. One of the essays that I found amusing is he's talking about Henry Ford and Taylorism, right? And how, in Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution and increasingly in the United States, there was this big effort to tell people not to masturbate, and not to have sex outside of marriage. They were really pushing sexual morality, right? Don't have sex outside of marriage. Don't masturbate, And why? Why were they pushing that? Well, they were pushing that because nervous energy makes you work faster on the assembly line, right? If you are only having sex, very rarely for the purpose of procreating children, if you're never masturbating, you have a lot more nervous energy to move the boxes and you work harder. It was that simple. Right? And it was about, economics. And he also talked about how, at the time in Italy, and I didn't know this, the reputation of peasants, rural people, was that they were all a bunch of crazy sex freaks, right? That they had sex with animals and they were all having affairs. And it was like the urban people in the cities who worked in factories were kind of enforcing this rigid puritanical code. Whereas rural folks, peasants who are generally seen as more conservative, there was this stereotype of them in Italy as being wild sex freaks because they weren't regulated to work on an assembly line. I think that's fascinating. And there's other essays that Antonio Gramsci writes on these kinds of issues, right? So, and that again, it's showing how the culture, the values of the culture, the themes in art, the themes in movies reflect the needs of the ruling class. And that is true, right? Karl Marx wrote that, the ruling ideology of every epoch is the ruling ideology of the ruling class, right? And that the ideology of Western capitalist society is the ideology of the ruling class, right? And even on the left, right, we got BreadTube that believes in capitalism as long as the workers get a stock dividend instead of a paycheck, right? That's basically what they believe, right? Libertarianism, liberalism, all of this, all the ideology that you get from the highest heights of society are going to be the ideologies of the ruling class. So there you go. All right. Anyway, next question. Soviet communism bad, Chinese communism good. I think the person was asking, they were talking about how in the 70s and 80s, some people would argue that Soviet communism was bad and Chinese communism was good. Well, what that's about is that starting in about 1969, China pivoted toward aligning with the United States in its foreign policy. The first place that it was very blatant was Angola. I guess, so in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, you had the Prague Spring, where there was this anti-communist uprising in Czechoslovakia. I'm not familiar with this. He talks about handing cash to organized labor. Oh, we could talk about that, actually. Yeah, I know about that. CIA, organized labor influence. All right. But in 1968, you had this anti-communist, hippy-dippy, synthetic left, artist, intellectual uprising against Soviet communism. And it was being blatantly supported by the CIA. Radio Free Europe was cheering it on. There were members of this right-wing group called Young Americans for Freedom that were part of it. It was a right-wing anti-communist revolt. Dubček was the leader of it. As soon as he took over Czechoslovakia, he immediately cut off support to the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. So ultimately, the Soviet Union had to move in and crush the Prague Spring, 1968. Well, China condemned that. They condemned the Soviet Union's intervention in Czechoslovakia. And then 1969, the CIA started sending, extremist forces into Portugal to fight the MPLA in Angola. I'm sorry, extremist forces into Angola. So Angola at the time was a colony of Portugal, and there was a communist revolutionary group fighting for the liberation of the people called the MPLA, the People's Liberation Movement of Angola. And they're currently the ruling party in Angola. But there was this other group called UNITA, and they were claiming to be a Maoist communist group, and they were supported by the CIA. And China sent its military advisors and weapons to UNITA. And the CIA also sent weapons and military advisors to UNITA. So you had the CIA and the US government on the same team in Angola fighting against a communist-led national liberation movement. And that was a moment that everyone went, what's going on here? Then in 1973, Pinochet took power in Chile and, slaughtered all the communists, brutal military coup. China immediately recognized Pinochet. Mao met with Pinochet, and China supported the Pinochet government. And, in Iran, there was a big struggle in Iran against the Shah of Iran. It was a brutal tyrant who was oppressing people, and the Iranian communists were leading strikes and protests, and the Islamists and Khomeini were underground resisting the Shah. Well, the Shah's wife went to China, and they gave her a big, huge parade. And in Ethiopia and Eritrea, there were communist resistance forces that were fighting against, the government of Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia. China supported Haile Selassie. I actually have a biography of Mao called The Morning Deluge. It was like a pro-Chinese Communist Party biography of Mao. The opening quote in the book is from Haile Selassie, the US-backed dictator, the Emperor of Ethiopia. So starting in about 1969, because the Soviet Union had screwed over China, right? Because the Soviet Union had pulled out their aid in 1961 and basically devastated China's economy. At first, China tried to be like super revolutionary. They said, we're going to be even more revolutionary than the Soviet Union. But then it became clear that they were isolated. They were cut off from the rest of the world. The only country that would trade with them was Albania and then Verhoeven. And because of that, eventually, 1969, 68, 69, they started aligning with the United States. And Nixon visited China and was welcomed to China with a parade. They welcomed him to China. And, Nixon, actually, there's an exchange between Mao and Nixon where Mao said to Nixon, he said, you're a rightist. And he said, I trust rightists more than I trust leftists. And some people wonder what Mao was getting at when he said that. But I guess he was saying that like right-wing leaders in the West are a little more honest about what they believe, whereas left-wing leaders in the West pretend to be socialists or something. But China and the United States started getting along. And the Rockefeller, one of the Rockefellers, David Rockefeller, one of them actually wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that's very pro-communist, or not pro-communist, but pro-Chinese Communist Party, saying, China is, China, Mao is a great leader, and he's not a puppet of the Soviet Union. He stood up to those evil Soviets, and and the Rockefellers, started selling oil to China, and China started buying oil from the Rockefellers and from, American corporations. And then ultimately, you had Deng Xiaoping, who came to power and started creating free economic zones. And China needed investment from the United States, right? That was how they were able to start building up their economy. This communist world was basically boycotting them. So, they had to start getting investment from the capitalist countries. It was a moment where China's foreign policy was starting to align with the United States, whereas Soviet foreign policy was, during the Brezhnev years, was more, they were supporting revolutionary movements in Cuba. They were supporting Cuba. They were supporting Libya. They were supporting revolutionary movements in Latin America. So Soviet foreign policy was anti-imperialist. Chinese foreign policy was drifting into the imperialist camp, right? And that's why you had in the United States, there was some feeling that Chinese communism was good. But then a lot of them were saying, well, it's not really communism. Chinese communism isn't really communism. They just believe, and that's what we hear now too. Oh, China's capitalist, Caleb. Nowadays it's whenever they're criticizing China, they're communist. And whenever China does anything good, it's because they're capitalist. But in the 70s and 80s, China was still making a point of saying that they believed in communism a lot more. Like Deng Xiaoping, that you had a much more ideological line. In the 90s, China really watered down the ideology. Now Xi Jinping is bringing communism back and making communism more popular. But, in the 70s and 80s, Deng Xiaoping was in power. They were still talking a lot about Marxism, but they were aligning with U.S. foreign policy. So because of that, you did have a weird kind of, U.S. media seemed somewhat sympathetic to Chinese communism. And like one thing, there are documentaries. I remember when I was a kid, I got like every documentary from the public library about Mao. And if the documentary was from like the 80s, it would say, well, Mao was definitely not Hitler, and Mao was the creator of modern China, and the Cultural Revolution was bad, but it was all his wife's fault. And, you would have, positive things in American media about Mao. Now, you go to Barnes and Noble, every book you find about Mao is just a hate-filled screed. He never brushed his teeth, and he was a pedophile, and he was a rapist, and he, ate little babies for dinner, and he was a monster. But in the 70s and 80s, the way Mao was portrayed was, well, Mao was, he was a decent figure. He made modern China. He wasn't perfect, but Mao was portrayed as in a somewhat sympathetic light. And that was because the United States was courting China as an ally against the Soviet Union, right? However, I think that 1989, the Tiananmen incident, that was a turning point because the Chinese communists had been getting friendly to the United States. and cooperating with the United States, but the US government still tried to overthrow them. They still staged an attempted color revolution that almost toppled the Chinese Communist Party. The United States basically staged an episode of unrest in 1989. Same time all these Eastern Bloc countries were falling, there was a staged episode of unrest in China. And I've exposed a lot of the myths about that, what really happened, etc. But there you go. So that's probably what that's about. All right, next question. General view on unions today. Have they sold out? Are they a vehicle for class interests? Unions, yes, most unions are dominated by reformist, Democratic Party loyal leadership. However, unions still are forces that have a material interest in fighting for the advancement of their workers. The better paid the workers are, the higher the dues money is that the labor union bosses collect. And so they have an interest in advancing the workers. And unions, generally, union contracts result in greater job security, right? Trust me, no matter how bad your union is, if you have a union contract, it's a lot harder to fire you than if you don't have one. Ask a teacher, right? Ask an auto worker, right? They have way more job security, right? At a lot of jobs in the United States, you can show up at work one day and your boss can be like, I don't like your face. You're fired. If you have a union contract, they can only fire you for specific reasons, right? So unions are good generally. That said, they're not revolutionary. They're dominated by reformist forces that ultimately don't understand that the interest of the working class is contrary to the capitalist. Every union contract pretty much nowadays begins, like the opening clause of it will begin with a statement that the workers and the capitalists have the same interest. Did you know this? Go and read a union contract. It's fascinating. Every union contract, auto workers, teachers, government employees, will begin, there'll be a paragraph at the beginning that says the workers and the capitalists have the same interests and are on the same team. Well, anyone who's a Marxist knows that's bull honking. That's bullshit, right? The profits of the capitalists advance by cutting into the wages of the workers, right? It's the workers' surplus value that provides for the capitalists. The capitalists steal from the workers, right? That's how they make profits. Exploitation, right? This is the basis of understanding. But the fact that the unions, they make all of their, all of it whenever they sign a contract, the bosses basically make them sign this document that repudiates the Marxist ideology, that basically says we're on the same team. That serves a purpose. And that's one of the main weaknesses of labor unions is they're dominated by forces who don't ultimately believe in class struggle. Right? They believe unions are necessary. It's good for workers to have their own representative, but they don't fundamentally believe that we could have a society without capitalists. They don't believe that we could have a society where the banks, factories, and industries are run by the people and the means of production are operated according to a central plan. They don't believe that. Right? They don't believe the working class can take power. And that's a weakness on the labor movement. So unions are not bad per se, but they are dominated by leadership that are just foot soldiers of the Democratic Party. And increasingly, the labor movement is dominated by forces who believe in wokeism. And wokeism hurts the labor movement. Wokeism is the antidote to class consciousness. Wokeism says the working people deserve to be poor because, they're all a bunch of, bought off labor aristocrats and they have white privilege or male privilege. And, wokeism is destroying the labor movement. I've heard reports. There's a lot of people who watch these broadcasts who work in the labor movement, and they can tell you straight up, they can tell you about the wokeism and how, the way you advance in a lot of these labor unions is by ratting out somebody else, by calling out somebody else, by calling one of your coworkers racist or sexist, and that the woke ideology is tearing apart the labor movement, right? And that increasingly the labor unions are just becoming Democratic campaigning entities, right? Entities that campaign for the Democrats. But ultimately, the labor movement is going to have to change or else it's going to be crushed. And there have been some dramatic changes. The rise of Bernie Sanders was significant of that. So it's not a one page thing. And there's always a push and pull. The unions, they want to survive. They want to see wages go up, but they also are not revolutionary. So it's complicated. I'm not against unions. I'm not against unions, but I would say that the labor leadership that's tied to the Democratic Party is definitely a problem. And it's a barrier to class struggle in the United States. That's for sure. Right? Most people say China isn't socialist, can't define socialism. Exactly. But we'll put that out. I know, because socialist can't define socialism. All right. Next question. The problem is that people in the USA don't identify as workers, but with other interests. Do you agree? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, I agree. One of the saddest things that I've seen this my whole life, is racism among white workers is often justified in terms of their own oppression. And I had this conversation with people many times. I would go out and distribute a communist newspaper. I'd be explaining socialism to a low-income white person. And they would be with me. They'd say, yeah, the rich people have all the power. Yeah, the workers should rise up. But then I would say police brutality. I'd talk about racial discrimination. Immediately, they would say something like that, and they would get mad. And when I would press them, I'd say, you're saying police brutality doesn't happen. You're saying racism isn't real. The way they would argue against anti-racism would be by saying, I've suffered discrimination in my life. I lost a job. My boss treated me bad. Police treated me bad. My friend went to jail for something he didn't deserve. None of that takes away from what happens to black people. None of that. By saying that your boss screwed you over and you're white, that doesn't mean racism isn't real. By saying the police mistreated you and you're white, that doesn't mean racism isn't real. By saying that that you were mistreated by the criminal justice system and you're white, that doesn't make racism not real. But in their minds, it does, because no one has ever come to them and said that you can identify as a worker. There's no working class consciousness. And so in their mind, somehow acknowledging police brutality, acknowledging racial discrimination that black people face, acknowledging the oppression of other groups is somehow a threat to them. And that is the most toxic thing these woke people are doing. Because all working people suffer. All working people face humiliation on their jobs. All working people are treated unfairly by the criminal justice system. However, it is far worse for black people. It's far worse for Chicano people and Latino people. That's a fact. But if working people are never given permission to understand that they are oppressed as a worker and that they have an identity as a worker, as a proletarian, they're going to be hostile when they see another group talking about the discrimination that it faces. And that's the most heartbreaking thing. It's very tragic. And that's one of the worst things these wokes are doing. These wokes, they go to white workers and their message is, you had it too good. Bullshit. Tell a working class person who lives in a trailer, has got a relative in jail, has another relative who was getting shot at in Afghanistan. Go tell them that their life is too good because they're white. They're going to tell you, get out of there, right? But tell them, no, your life isn't good. You're oppressed by capitalism. And so are the black people. And in fact, the black people get it even worse than you do. And if we can team up with the black people and team up with the Chicano people and team up with women and the LGBT community and fight the capitalists, all of us can advance. We can raise living standards for all working people. That is the message of Marxism. That is what I was showing you at the beginning of the video. That's at the beginning of the video. That guy who's up there, let's make war against the capitalists. That's the message. And that's what these bread tubers are so terrified of people hearing. Because if people start to hear that, their bosses, Jeff Bezos and George Soros, the British royal family, are screwed, and they know it. They're terrified, absolutely terrified of class struggle solidarity ideology that says, yes, put the needs of the workers, the oppressed workers at the front. But our goal is to raise up our entire working class. It's not about shaming the white workers. It's not about wanting the white workers to have less. It's about getting them to understand that the way that everybody comes up by class solidarity, by mobilizing against capitalism. And that's what the Medicare for All marches are trying to accomplish. That's what the Center for Political Innovation is trying to accomplish. And this scares the bejesus out of these people because their whole grift is tearing down working people by accusing them of being privileged. And that is why they are so threatened by the work that we are doing. Because it doesn't just apply domestically. If you understand that the capitalist bosses are also trying to destroy Russia and China and Venezuela and Cuba, just like they're trying to destroy the black community, just like they're trying to destroy your living standards and your wages, if you could come to that understanding, this country is going to change really fast. This country is going to change real fast. And that's what they know. This is the dynamite that will ignite the class struggle. Class struggle solidarity. And wokeism is a synthetic creation. Identity politics, white skin privilege theory, postmodernism, settlers, the mythology of the white proletariat, all of this is an op to make sure that this doesn't come out. Because if people start to think this way, things will really start to change in this country. All right, next super chat question. Iraqi refugees in California. There are very few Iraqi refugees in the United States. The majority, I believe, are in Dearborn, Michigan. That's where the largest Arab American community in the United States is. And, most Iraqis, there are very few Iraqis in the United States. There's a lot of Iranians in the United States. They're Persians. They're not Arabs. There's a lot of Syrians in the United States, a lot of Yemenis. But there's very few, very, very few Iraqis in the United States. But Michigan is where you find Iraqis. And there's a lot of them are Shia Muslims who fled Iraq because of the Shia uprising against Saddam Hussein that happened in the early 90s. There was like a Shia Muslim uprising. And it was defeated, and then a lot of them fled to the United States. And a lot of them were supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq at the time because they just hated Saddam Hussein so much. A lot of them have now changed their minds since, and have become anti-war. But there was especially in the Detroit area, there were a lot of Iraqis that were vocally supporting the U.S. invasion. A lot of them were Shia Muslims who just had, they had been part of this Shia Muslim uprising, and they remembered the Iraq-Iran war, and it was an ethnic kind of, they saw Saddam Hussein as secular and not as religious as they are. And they also saw Saddam Hussein as a Sunni but as far as California, I don't know about Iraqis in California. I do know that there were a number of Iraqi Christians who were being deported from the United States during the administration of Trump. And that there were actually some struggles in Michigan on behalf of Iraqi Christians who were being deported, and that there were like community protests and such. So there you go. There you go. The Little Red Book. The Little Red Book it was a compilation. It's a book of quotations from Mao Zedong. It's basically Mao Zedong's Twitter page. So you have to understand that at the time that they were making the Chinese Revolution, the 1930s, 1940s, a lot of the population were illiterate. And so Mao wrote in a style where it was easier to memorize. And so a lot of the political training that the Chinese military had was done for memorization because not everyone could read at that point, right? There's a song, there's a song that's called the 8 Rules of Attention and the 9 Points of Discipline or something like that. But it's like a popular patriotic song in China. But it was this song they taught all the Chinese People's Liberation Army soldiers. That was the rules, and they had to remember the rules, and they didn't have them down because a lot of them were illiterate. So they had this song, and it's like dun 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 dun. Pete Seeger actually recorded his own version of it, which I think is pretty neat. But it was to memorize the rules. So a lot of the quotes from Mao are very concise. He's speaking in like little short paragraphs, right? And so, a lot of Mao's essays. And then also you'll notice that Mao writes in a very Confucian style. And Mao was influenced by the literary style of Confucius, the father of Chinese civilization. He writes about the 10 great relationships and the 4 great flaws and the 5 great thises and the 7 great that's, right? And why does he write that way? So you can memorize it, right? You can memorize it. The first one is this, second one is this, third one is this, right? It's for memorization. So you have to understand that's the literary style that Mao is using. And it sounds very mystical to us. A lot of Americans, we get all like, whoa, it's like, but no, it's not trying to be mystical. It serves a real pragmatic purpose, right? It's the style of Confucius, but it's for memorization. And so Mao has this style of writing where he's very to the point and very concise, right? So during the 1960s, Lin Biao, who was a leader of the People's Liberation Army, who was a close associate of Mao, is considered one of the fathers of the Cultural Revolution. He decided to give every soldier a book of quotations from Chairman Mao. And originally it was blue. It was blue. And it was just when you joined the army, you got your kit and, you got your gun and you got your, your bag with your pants and your shirt. And you also had this little blue book full of quotations from Mao Zedong. Originally, the Little Red Book has an introduction from Lin Biao. Lin Biao says Mao Zedong is the greatest Marxist-Leninist in all history. And the Little Red Book, it was because Mao was kind of falling out of favor, right? The Great Leap Forward happened, and the economic results of the Great Leap Forward were not good, right? The Soviet Union had cut off China. China tried to continue speeding ahead with industrialization. Didn't work out too well. There were some problems, obviously. And they had some pretty big economic problems, and so Mao was kind of falling out of favor. And so the beginning of the Cultural Revolution was basically Mao was trying to mobilize society, to push back against Liu Shaoqi. Liu Shaoqi was this pro-Soviet guy. He was like more favored by the Soviet Union, and he was critical of Mao. And so they were kind of mobilizing the cult of personality around Mao, the worship of Mao, the mass movement around Mao. They were kind of mobilizing that as a way of beating back Liu Shaoqi. So the Little Red Book, they were giving all the soldiers this book of quotations from Mao. And then they made it red, because red is more communist, obviously. And they started distributing it among the population at large. And, when they had the Cultural Revolution, the groups they called the Red Guards, which were students who ran around making sure the party line was being enforced everywhere. And, they would, change the names of stores to be more communist. If your store was called like the Imperial Grocery Store, you can't have imperialism. So they would change it to the Communism Grocery Store. They were going around changing, breaking ancient temples and destroying statues and trying to make society in line with communism. And they carried around the Little Red Book as their like sacred book, right? And it's this book of quotations from Mao Zedong. Now, interestingly, Lin Biao tried to overthrow Mao. He like did a coup attempt against Mao and like tried to fly away, and his plane crashed. He was trying to get to the Soviet Union. So actually, after they announced what had happened with Lin Biao, all the school kids cut the first 2 pages out of the Red Book, the introduction by Lin Biao, because Lin Biao was no good. So they cut him out of the Red Book. They canceled him. They ripped him out. So if you have a Little Red Book from China that's old enough, it'll often have 2-page stubs for the Lin Biao introduction that was cut out and thrown in the garbage. But yeah, it was kind of the symbol. It was an icon of the Cultural Revolution. It was the ideological textbook of the Chinese Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution. And you can still get it. They still have it in China, and you can still buy it. But it's no longer like held up the way it once was. At one point that was like the sacred book in China. It's not that anymore. It's understood that this is an important book of quotations from a leader of the founder of the country, great revolutionary who defeated the imperialists and started us on the road to industrializing as a country, but he also did this awful thing called the Cultural Revolution. So he's a complex figure, and the Little Red Book is still studied in China. It's still valued, but it doesn't have the central role that it once had, right? And I mean, I remember what was funny is when I was in high school, that was when I first got the Little Red Book, You know, the Little Red Book is a very patriotic book, right? There's a chapter, Building Our Country Through Diligence and Frugality, right? I mean, it's like, I remember like one of my teachers saw that I had the Little Red Book and he said, "Oh, what's this?" And he opened it, it's like, for the good of the country, the minority must submit to the majority and everyone should be loyal to the homeland. He's like, wow. He's like, I agree with this. I thought it was really funny. He was like a right-wing Republican, but he agreed with it. I mean, it's a very patriotic text, right? It's about loving the homeland, loving the country, hating the imperialists, socialism and communism. In order to have a revolution, you must have a revolutionary party. It's a great book. I recommend you read it. A Little Red Book, right? The Little Red Book. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge and important book. At one point, it outsold the Bible. More copies of it were selling than the Bible, and it's an important textbook of Chinese communism. I think the Center for Political Innovation may eventually publish our own edition of it with an introduction about China and Mao and stuff. That's like on one of our list of things to do, is to publish our own edition of the Little Red Book. But I mean, not everything in the Little Red Book is necessarily correct. I mean, a lot of people point to the chapter on war and peace and a lot of the statements about violence, right? Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. I mean, well, all of that is referring to the nature of the state, and that ultimately the Chinese communists had to form their own army, the Red Army, to drive out the Japanese invaders. And, I mean, and that again, all that stuff is important in context. Not my attitude toward Mao, Stalin, Enver Hoxha, Fidel Castro, Kim Il Sung, Gaddafi, who else? Iraqi Baath socialism, Khomeini and the Islamic Revolution of Iran, Bolivarianism and in Latin America, Nkrumah and African socialism, Tanzania and their socialist system. All of this, we should study all of this and blindly follow none of it. Study all of it, but blindly follow none of it. And as we study all of it, we should be trying to figure out a formula that can mobilize the masses of people here in the United States. We should study all of it, blindly follow none of it. Trotsky, anarchism, right? All of it, but blindly follow none of it and try to figure out a formula for which the American people can come to understand that the future of their country is not in private capitalists getting rich off of everybody else. It's not in foreign wars and imperialism and plunder, but rather it's in working people coming together and having a government of action that fights for working families. We published the Green Book by Gaddafi. I'm glad we published that. We're on the brink we're about to publish a new book. I guess I won't reveal. Maybe I've revealed it before on these streams, but I'm not going to say it again. We're about to publish another book of writings from a very, very important, I mean, it hasn't happened yet. My friend. I can't comment on it. It hasn't happened, but it's going to be important. The party congresses are very important in China, but I can't comment on Congress that hasn't happened yet, my friend. Sorry. Anyway, we're about to publish a book by an important, anti-imperialist leader around the world that I think desperately needs to be published. And, we're going to do that. We're going to keep trying to put out as many books as possible. All right. Will Europe suffer as gas is sold in rubles? Sure, because in order to buy Russian gas, they're going to have to set up with a Russian bank and exchange their currency for rubles. And that's going to be an additional expense, right? And this is Russia pushing back against the sanctions, right? They tried to devalue their currency. The USA put all these sanctions on there, and the ruble lost the value. So then Putin said, okay, well, now since we're going to have to keep selling gas, they can't not have us sell gas. We're going to make you buy that gas in our currency, and that'll make the value of their currency go back up, right? I mean, they're pushing back. And yeah, the European countries that are going to have to get rubles, they're going to have costs. Now, there's going to be exceptions. From what I understand, the government will give exceptions to the rubles rule. It's going to be an additional expense, but Russia's facing economic warfare right now. I mean, they're trying to crush Russia's economy. So because of that, Russia's got to find a way to bring in more revenue and increase the value of their currency, etc. So what Russia's doing makes perfect sense. All right. Abolishing private property. I don't like that phrasing, because when you say abolish private property, people immediately think that's my house that I spent years working hard to pay off. That's my car that I spent years saving up to get. That's, my toothbrush and my, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much. When workers hear abolish private property, they think that means personal property. Private property in the communist sense refers to means of production, means entities that are used for no other purpose than making wealth. The Kroc family, as the owners of the McDonald's franchise, they've never even been in most McDonald's. There's thousands and thousands of McDonald's restaurants in the world. They've never even been in most of them, right? But it's their private property. They have a certificate of ownership that says they own the McDonald's franchise. Well, eventually the idea is that private property, like big restaurant franchises, will be public property, right? Eventually, right? But that doesn't mean that the personal property of working people, like their home, like their car, like their, electronic devices, that doesn't mean that that's going to be taken away from them. So that phrase, abolish private property, which is in the Communist Manifesto quite a bit, it's not a good phrase to use, and it gets misrepresented a lot. So it's unfortunate, but ultimately, Marxists make a distinction between personal property and private property. Personal property is stuff that you use for yourself, and private property is what you use to make more money. And that's the difference. All right. Next question. The CIA organized influence and organized labor. J. Lovestone. Good old J. Lovestone. J. Lovestone was the leader of the American Communist Party in the 1920s. And, Stalin came to power, and at the 6th Congress of the Communist International, they changed their line. They said Social Democrats are the main enemy. The Social Democrats are the main enemy, and we need to have a united front from below, class against class. And the Communist Party went into their third period, they called it, where they zigzagged, right? They went, and that's the Trotskyites. They think it's a betrayal. I think it was the correct line. It was the correct thing to do because the Social Democrats were the main enemy at that point. But anyway, the Communist parties of the world started shifting to focusing on Social Democrats being their main enemy, right? Because Social Democrats were holding back the revolution. J. Lovestone was a leader of the American Communist Party, former boxer, born in Lithuania, Jewish American, grew up in New York City, and he didn't agree with that. He said, no, I don't agree. Social Democrats are the main enemy. And he was very popular among organized labor. He had a lot of allies and friends in the labor unions. And he said, well, I don't know. And he actually got a majority to vote for him at the Communist Party convention and not go along with it. But then the Soviet Union said, no, if you say the Communist International and that their policies don't apply to your country, that's called American exceptionalism. And they kicked out J. Lovestone for American exceptionalism. And that's where the term American exceptionalism comes from. So J. Lovestone was booted out of the Communist Party for American exceptionalism. So he was out of the Communist Party. J. Lovestone's out of the Communist Party for American exceptionalism. Once he's out of the Communist Party, he starts his own group called the Communist Party Opposition, parenthesis, Communist Party, parenthesis, opposition. And it's just this other Communist Party. They have a newspaper called Workers' Age. There's a guy named Bertram Wolfe, who's like a really good writer who's associated with the Lovestone group. And it's just this other Communist Party. It's like you have the Trotskyites, and then you have the Lovestonites. Trotskyites are called the left opposition. The Lovestonites, generally, they're aligned with Bukharin, and they're considered the right opposition. So the Lovestonites, they're this breakaway from the Communist Party, but they have a lot of labor union bosses that are in their group. And they keep saying that eventually the Communist Party is going to change its mind and let them back in. And the Communist Party says, no, we're not going to let you back in. And then in the 1930s, you have the explosion of the CIO. It's the new union. The AFL is the old craft union. The CIO is a more radical union that's anti-racist, that is for industrial workers, auto workers, steel workers. CIO is growing. There's different forces in the CIO. Communist Party is a big part of the CIO. The Socialist Party is a big part of the CIO. The Trotskyites are a big part of the CIO. Well, J. Lovestone and his followers in the Communist Party opposition, they join the CIO. And they hate the Communist Party. They hate the Communist Party. And the Communist Party hates them. Backstabbing traitors, American exceptionalists. And they say, Communist Party, well, they're taking their orders from the Kremlin. They're obeying Stalin. They kicked us out because we wanted to do what was right in the labor movement. And so basically, Jay Lovestone figures out a way that his group, if there's any labor union boss who's having a fight with the Communist Party, he runs to them and has his people work for that labor union leader. So Victor Reuther, the Reuthers, right? Victor Reuther, Walter Reuther, they're like these labor union bosses, and they're call themselves socialists, but they don't like the Communist Party. Well, sometimes they fight the Communist Party, sometimes they don't, depending on what the policies are. Well, when they're fighting with the Communist Party, they call up Jay Lovestone. And Jay Lovestone says, yes, sir, I'll help you fight the Communist Party. I hate those bastards. So Jay Lovestone is this professional anti-communist in the labor movement. Whatever the Communist Party is doing, he does the opposite. And the Trotskyites are the same way, but it's a little more complicated with them. The Trotskyites are still a little more, they still are a little more ideological. Jay Lovestone, it doesn't seem to really be about ideology. He's a labor leader. He's a communist, but the Communist Party screwed him, and he hates the Communist Party, and he vaguely supports unions and socialism, but he's not really ideological. Whereas the Trotskyites, they're like ultra revolutionary, and they think they're the Fourth International, and they're so Jay Lovestone is much more blatantly just whatever the communists do, he does the opposite. Whatever the Communist Party's doing, he does the opposite. So if there's ever a labor union boss, labor union boss who doesn't like the Communist Party, well, Jay Lovestone is there to help them because he hates the communists also. And he builds this whole network of people, the Lovestonites, Bertram, Wolf, and it's like thousands of people that work for him in the labor unions. They have their own communist newspaper. They're called the Lovestonites. And then World War II happens. After World War II, the U.S. government is like, we are going to get the Communist Party out of the labor movement. Well, Jay Lovestone says, I can help you do that. I've been fighting him in the labor movement for years. So the CIA hired Jay Lovestone, and Jay Lovestone had lists of all kinds of people who were in the Communist Party, and he turns them over to the government, and he works with the FBI, and he helps drive the Communist Party out of the United Auto Workers and out of the Steel Workers Union, and he's just a professional anti-communist. And then after the United Auto Workers, the UAW, after they kicked out the Communist Party, they got paid by the CIA to start something called the Solidarity Center or the Solidarity House. And it's basically this entity that coordinates anti-communist unions around the world. It's this nonprofit that's funded by the UAW, staffed by UAW members, that goes around the world, supporting anti-communism and anti-Sovietism in the labor movement. Jay Lovestone is the director of that. And Jay Lovestone was the main CIA labor union guy, in the United States. He ran their work. He was Jay Lovestone, and he was this professional anti-communist labor leader. And the culmination of his career, of Jay Lovestone's career, was in the 80s, when Solidarity, the Roman Catholic dock workers, when they went on strike against the communist government in Poland. And Jay Lovestone was directing them. And Jay Lovestone, he was the guy who did it. So if you want to know about CIA work in the labor unions, you got to look up the Solidarity House. That's the first thing, the Solidarity House. And the second thing is you got to look up Jay Lovestone. And that's what it's all about. And even today, they talk about these free trade unions in China, free trade unions, right? When workers in China go on strike, which happens all the time, there's a lot of strikes in China. Usually it's done by the government union, the communist union. The local workers in this communist union go on strike. There you go, right? But you'll notice that sometimes when there's labor unrest in China, the U.S. government and the New York Times or the Washington Post will run op-eds. Why won't China legalize free trade unions? And that sounds reasonable to most people. Like, yeah, why do they have to join the government union? Why can't they pick any union? Well, free trade unions are ones run by the CIA and Jay Lovestone and the Solidarity House. And this actually came up in my debate with Vosh, actually. He tried to debate me on this, but that's the point, right? It's that that Jay Lovestone, and he ran the CIA's labor work. It's Jay Lovestone. So you want to know about CIA work, check out Jay Lovestone. And honestly, I'll just be honest with you. I have thought about Jay Lovestone a lot. I've read a biography of him and all that. I think that the Communist Party made a mistake. They had way too much of a with us or against us attitude. They should have found a way that when Jay Lovestone said, you know what, I don't want to quit the labor unions because I don't want to quit the labor unions. I don't want to make Social Democrats the main enemy. They should have found a way that Jay Lovestone could leave the Communist Party and still be like their friend and ally. I'm just being real with you. But they had this with us or against us attitude where Jay Lovestone, oh, you don't agree with Comintern? Well, screw you. Get out of here. Don't let the, you bastard, you traitor. And because of that, Jay Lovestone ended up working for the CIA. Jay Lovestone was a really brilliant organizer. He was a really skilled writer and speaker, but he had a falling out with Moscow. And because he had a falling out with Moscow, one way or another, he ended up working for the CIA. And that's a big problem that the communist parties have around the world. Like, and when I mean like the actual, like the franchise, right? The Comintern parties, like the official dignified communist parties very much have this attitude, you're with us or against us. That's why the Communist Party is like so freaked out by me, because I'm not with them, so I must be against them, right? That's how they all are. They call themselves the real deal. If you're not with us, you're not really. And it's a stupid attitude because no revolution in history has ever happened with one party just taking power. No, there's a coalition. The Bolsheviks had an alliance with the left Mensheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries. You know, Fidel Castro, he brought together like 6 different groups in order to take that power in Cuba. In Venezuela, they have the Patriotic Pole, the United Socialist Party, and the Fatherland for All Party, and the Communist Party, and the Tupac Amaru Party, and this attitude where it's like you're either with us or against us. That is an attitude that leads to communists being isolated from the masses. And great, skilled organizers like Jay Lovestone end up on the other side. You know, if the Communist Party had found a way to say, you know what, Jay Lovestone, we're going to do this thing fighting Social Democrats, and they had not made him their blood enemy, right? If they had just found a way to be like, okay, we don't agree with you, who knows what could have happened, right? The Communist Party's line changed, right? And when they did the Popular Front in the 1935, they stopped doing the fighting the Social Democrats. They started building a Popular Front against fascism. There's no reason for them to fight Jay Lovestone at that point because they were trying to work with the union bosses. And so he would have agreed with them. But this is a problem. And it's this, when you get into this all or nothing thinking, it's a trap. It's a deadly trap, right? And that's cults. A lot of the communist groups are like that, right? I think about my own experience, you know? I mean, I was in this tiny communist group here in the United States, right? And honestly, like, you know, that's completely different than being in like the Communist Party in the 20s. But even the experience I had with them, I didn't want to fight with these people. I wanted to leave and be on good terms with them. And I tried my hardest to just kind of move into doing my own thing. Okay, but it just turned into this big, ugly smear fest. Got so negative, right? And when you have this with us or against us attitude, which develops groups that are isolated, that are weak, that are under attack from the government, they develop this with us or against us attitude. And if you have a with us or against us attitude, that leads to a situation where, you know, well, it also, first of all, it leads to a situation where there's only one smart person in the group. Because if another smart person comes along, they're a threat, right? So there's that. And number 2, it leads to a situation where, oh, someone leaves the group. Well, they're the enemy. They're a traitor. They must. And that's not, if you're serious about politics, you don't make enemies at the drop of a hat. You don't have the attitude, we're the real party and everyone else is a phony. You don't do that. And the communist parties, the Comintern parties, the Communist Party, USA, the Communist Party of Britain, the Communist Party of France, they have this attitude. We are the real party. And everyone else is a fraud and a phony. And if you're not with us, you're against us. And that is a recipe for disaster. And a lot of these little tiny communist parties have that attitude. A lot of the Maoist groups, a lot of the Trotskyite groups. Oh, and it's a recipe for disaster. The Center for Political Innovation, we allow dual membership. Did you know that? We allow people, you can be in another party and be a member of the Center for Political Innovation. We have a lot of members of the Communist Party in our group. And the Communist Party has really talked shit about CPI. Did you know that? The Communist Party has written horrendous things about us. Doesn't matter. If you're in the Communist Party and you want to join CPI, fine. Communist Party might have a problem with it. We don't. If you are in, you're in the PSL. PSL doesn't like us. I've written some critiques of PSL on behalf of of CPI, but you know what? We have members of PSL that are in the CPI. That's fine. We're a think tank. We're not a party. And we don't have one true party syndrome. All right. We're not sitting here going like we're the real deal and everyone else is a fraud. We do have a unique strategy out of the movement to the masses. But at the same time, you know, we're not, it's not with us or against us. That's not how we operate. Right. And it's that attitude where it becomes like a cult. It becomes like a one true religion. Are you truly following Jesus, or have you, you know, given into sin? That's not serious politics. Right. And a lot of these groups are kind of like little cults. And it's the ego trip of one or two really old boomers who think that they're the greatest Marxist ever and want everyone to bow and be in awe of them. And that's why they go nowhere. And, you know, if we're going to actually be serious, if we're going to actually get the United States to socialism, we have to have the attitude that, you know, we could disagree. People can disagree. And that's kind of my attitude towards these things, right? Is that people can disagree. You know, it's not the end of the world. And, you know, that's how things have got to go. All right. Next question. Oh, it's the last one, too. So if anyone else has a super chat, now would be the time, as I'm answering this last question. Now would be the time. Now would be the time to bring in your last super chat. Because if not, I actually have strength, folks. We've been going for about 3 hours. It's about to hit the 3-hour mark, but I'm not out of energy. I won't be on this weekend because I'll be traveling. I'll be going to my friend's wedding. So you got a super chat for me, hit me up, folks, because I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be on here. I'm out of super chats, but I've got plenty of energy. So we'll do the last question, but send me those last super chats. If you want me to talk about it, now's the time, because this is the last super chat. So if there's not another super chat, I'm going to wrap it up here. But anyhow, the person super chatted, people who say that China is socialist often cannot define socialism. Right. What is socialism? What is socialism? What is socialism? Right? Well, there are different definitions. But ultimately, the definition that the Center for Political Innovation uses comes from Marx and Engels. Socialism is when society as a whole takes control of the means of production, right? It's you know, when the proletariat seizes the political power and wins the battle for democracy and uses its political supremacy to wrest by degree the capital from the bourgeoisie. It's centralizing instruments of production in the hands of the state and raising up productive forces, right? Or Frederick Engels, I've still got it up here, right? What he said, right? The proletariat frees the means of production from the character of capital they have thus far borne, gives their socialized character complete freedom to work itself out. Socialized production upon a predetermined plan becomes henceforth possible. Right? Socialism is when the banks, factories, and industries and major centers of economic power are organized to serve public good and not the profits of a few. That's what socialism is. If production is organized for profit, if the anarchy of production, the chaos of the market prevails, that's capitalism. But if the means of production are organized to serve public good and the working class, the broad majority of people, have a government that is loyal to them and is on their side against the capitalists and controlling the capitalists and forcing the economy to work in the interest of the people, that's socialism, right? That's socialism. NATO was created with Nazi leadership, as was West Germany's leadership. This, combined with U.S. capitalist funding of the arming of Hitler, is the U.S. Anglo-Empire continuation of the Reich. I wrote in my book on Kamala Harris, I'll answer this and then I'll answer the other one. I wrote in my book on Kamala Harris that Germany is very unfairly treated because a lot of people think that Nazism flows from Germany, that Germans just are a naturally authoritarian, racist people. That's not true. Germany was actually one of the most progressive countries of the world until Hitler came along. No country had a bigger communist party outside the Soviet Union than Germany did. No country had a bigger social democratic party outside of, well, maybe, I don't know, but they had a huge social democratic party. They had a gay rights movement in the 1920s in Germany. They had gay bars. They had institutes that studied gay rights. Hitler came along to crush the progressivism of the German people. And the ideology that Hitler espoused was a British ideology. It was the ideology of the British ruling class, Malthusianism, right? The idea that some people are useless eaters who need to be exterminated because they're a tax on the community, right? And and the idea that one race is superior to the other. That's British Empire colonialist ideology if you ever had it, right? And anti-Semitism and all of these things are things that the British ruling class was promoting. Anti-communist conspiracy theories and racial supremacism and Malthusianism and reducing the population, racial pseudoscience. All of these were British Empire ideas. The British royal family was very sympathetic with Hitler. And yes, are there conservatives and right wingers and racists in Germany? Sure. But the idea that Hitler represents what the German people are all about is wrong. In fact, Hitler came in to crush the real danger that Germany would join the Soviet Union. And geopolitically, that has always been the fear of the British Empire, that Germany and Russia will become allies, because then that'll basically mean that Britain's hold over the European mainland ends, and that's what they're afraid of. So there you go. So yeah, but yeah, I guess you could say that the Anglo ideas are the Nazi ideas. And before Hitler came along, there was this thing called the British Empire, and they killed millions of people in India, and they killed millions of people in Africa. They gunned down whole villages with primitive machine guns. And I mean, the crimes of the British Empire in terms of starving people to death, imposing free trade on people, and free market capitalism at the barrel of a gun. What they did to China with their opium wars, what they did all over the world. Horrendous. British imperialism is a monstrous thing. The ideology of Adam Smith has killed millions of people. There would never be communism, and there would never be fascism as a political movement. Neither of those movements would have emerged if it wasn't widely understood in the 1920s and 30s that free trade, free market capitalism was a murderous system that was killing millions of people. Right? Communism was the left-wing response to it. Fascism was a weird form of capitalist Bonapartism meant to stabilize, capitalist societies. But both of them were a response to the fact that free market, free trade capitalism, what we now call neoliberalism, some people call it neoclassical economics, Adam Smith economics doesn't work, and it kills millions of people. And that is a fact. That is a fact. And the whole world knew that. And over the course of the Cold War, the USA worked really, really hard to get people to forget it. And then they did it again in the 90s. When the Soviet Union restored capitalism, millions of people starved to death and died. They imposed free trade shock therapy economics on Latin America. Millions of people died. Yeah, I mean, British Empire economics is brutal, and it's very Nazi in its worldview. It says that if people are poor, they deserve to be poor, right? I believe one of these British commentators, right? She was saying they should get rid of the NHS, right? She's a right winger, an extreme right winger in Britain. She said, they should get rid of the National Healthcare Service, right? And someone said, well, what if people die because they can't get the medical care? And she said, that's good. Then they won't reproduce and they won't have children. And then we won't have weak people who can't work hard enough to get medical care. That's a British Empire attitude. That's Malthusianism, right? And that's very much how the Nazis thought. Might is right, etc. Right? This is British Empire ideas, and it's very disgusting. If you read, A Christmas Carol, right, the classic novel by Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol, right? What does they come to the office, they're asking Scrooge for charity, and he says, "Oh, I don't want to give to charity. That's what the prisons and the poorhouses are for." And he says, "Well, some people would rather die than go there, Mr. Scrooge." And he says, well, if they'd rather die, then they better do it and decrease the surplus population, right? That's Malthusianism. That's the ideology of the British Empire, that some people are just naturally inferior, that we should let the poor die. We should not have social programs to help people. Libertarianism, Adam Smith, Ayn Rand, Milton Friedman, those ideas are murderous, genocidal ideas that have killed millions of people all over the world. Like in the 18th century, the 19th century, when the British were spreading them all around the world at the barrel of a gun and forcing countries to join the free trade, creating famines in Ireland, creating famines in the Caribbean, and slaughtering people, slaughtering whole villages in Africa, slaughtering people, and all over the planet. There's not a single corner of the planet where we haven't seen the crimes of British imperialism. The British Empire is a monstrous entity. And largely American imperialism that now is the dominant force is rooted in the ideology of the British Empire, right? I mean, the Round Table Group was created with the will of Cecil Rhodes, the colonizer of Rhodesia, of Zimbabwe, which is, he called it Rhodesia after himself. Cecil Rhodes, his ideology was very much the British Empire ideology. And, the Round Table Group that he created with his will established what's called the Council on Foreign Relations. Look at how many presidents, how many people in Congress are Rhodes Scholars. They come from the Rhodes Scholarship Program. Right? British Empire ideology is very widespread in the United States, and it is murderous ideology. It's elitist ideology. It's dangerous. All right. Any info to share about CPI Chicago and CPI National later this year? We are hoping to do a conference, another anti-imperialist conference in Chicago. The aim is to do it in mid-May, but we have to get the finances in order. And we're talking about getting the money together. And if we can get the money together, we're going to announce a date and we're going to do that. If the money doesn't come together, we can't do it. That's just how it works. I've sunk a lot of my own personal funds into making that conference in Austin, Texas happen. And I don't regret it one bit. It was really important, but I can't do that again. I can't, be that nervous about money. I was so nervous about money in the lead up to that conference. I was just on edge, and I can't do that again. We have to have all our ducks in a row. I still owe some people, and we can't have that happen. We need to get our finances in order, before we can do the Chicago conference. However, June 22nd through 26th, we are going to do our national gathering. It'll be in a rural area in a countryside. It'll be like a 4-day communist summer camp that we're going to do. And we're figuring out the details about that. We got a long time till June. We're going to figure that out. That's going to happen. We do have the funds to do that, at least at the very minimum. I mean, we're going to ask a contribution from every attendee, obviously. There'll be a fee. It won't be very much, but there'll be a fee for attending. And that's going to be important. We are going to do our 4-day communist school this summer, our national gathering of CPI. But as far as a public conference in Chicago, we don't know yet. We just don't have the funds together. But if the funds come together, if we can get the resources together, if the money comes together, we'll do it. And it'll be that simple. If you want to make a contribution to help us do it, I guess you asked for it, reestablishment. I hate to be that guy with my hand out, but reestablishment, if you or others want to help us have a conference in Chicago this spring, if you want to make a contribution toward making that happen, toward making sure we have the resources to do it, by all means, shoot me money on PayPal. Right? My PayPal information, I'll drop it in the chat right now. And if you can shoot me some money on PayPal, if we can get the amount of money, it is not cheap to do one of those conferences. But if we can get the money together, and there's other people we're talking to, et cetera, if we can get the money together, we'll do another one of those conferences. If not, we will do it. We will do our national gathering. That is going to happen. We are going to do our national gathering because we have a lot of young people who want to come together, and it's within our means to do this national gathering. But as far as the public conference, we just need to get the money together. So yeah, I'm dropping my PayPal in the chat, and if you can help make a contribution, that would be great. That would be great. We can do that. So that's there. I just dropped it in the chat. If you want to shoot me a PayPal contribution, that would be great. We're just going to figure it out. And obviously we're going to have really big security because I'm sure there's people now, there's these hate documentaries from Sophie from Mars. And, look, there's a lot of people that are just so determined to keep real socialism from coming into being. They are so determined not to see black and white unite and fight, not to see people of different political backgrounds come together and organize around an economic program to rescue the country. They're terrified of us. They are terrified of us. The bread tube grifters and the ultra left Maoist nut jobs there you go. So yeah, if you want to shoot me a contribution, I'm dropping it in the chat one more time. That would be great if we can get the money together to do a conference in Chicago, which there's a very good chance that we're going to do it, but we just have to get all our ducks in a row. And I can't be like nervous about money the way I was in the lead up to that Texas conference. That was, oh boy, I spent like the 3-4 weeks beforehand kind of panicking about money. You can ask Keaton if you want. Ask Keaton about it. I was panicking about money. He was calling me up. You got to pay for this. And I'm like, oh God. So there you go. But, we're going to figure it out. And if we don't do it in Chicago, it's not the end of the world, right? I would like to do it in Chicago. I think that would be better to do it. But that conference we did in Austin, all the videos aren't even up yet. We haven't even gotten the videos of our Austin conference on the web yet. We're still getting those videos up on the web. So, it's not the, I mean, we'll see, but if we can do it in Chicago, that'll be great. If not, we're definitely doing the national gathering June 22nd through 26th. More information about that to be announced. And that's only for members. You have to be a dues-paying member of the Center for Political Innovation to come to that. And thank you, David Fox, for the super chat. David Fox is an amazing labor activist. He's a founder of Australians for a New Democracy in Australia, standing up to Russophobia and imperialist rhetoric in Australia. So, yeah, I mean, that's what we're doing, folks. So there you go. There you go, folks. I think we're going to end here. I think this is the end of the stream. This is a longer stream, the longest stream we've done in a while. I think it started off with me, having to send people messages and work stuff and disjointed. But now we're back. We're back. We got going. The super chats gave me plenty to talk about. So I think now we're going to end this. So we'll have the upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. All right. The danger of a new world war still exists. People of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night, folks. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working